Hey guys, tonight we venture into the shadowy corners of Victorian England, where rational progress walked hand in hand with the most peculiar supernatural beliefs you can imagine. You wake up in a gaslit world where every creaking floorboard whispers of ghosts, where mirrors hold dangerous powers, and where the simple act of spilling salt could doom your entire household to misfortune. The morning light filtering through heavy velvet curtains illuminates a society obsessed with death, spirits, and invisible forces lurking behind every respectable facade. Picture yourself stirring in a Victorian bedroom as dawn breaks over London's smoky skyline. You reach for the mirror on your dressing table, but pause during the night. Someone has carefully draped it with black cloth. This isn't mourning, this is protection. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, revealing why we still knock on wood or avoid walking under ladders centuries later. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, or perhaps share your own family's strange superstitions that have been passed down through generations. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You slip from beneath thick woolen blankets, your bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The first rule of Victorian morning survival: never look in an uncovered mirror before you've said your prayers. Mirrors, those silvered portals, and were believed to be windows between worlds. During sleep, when your soul wandered freely, an unprotected mirror could trap your spirit or allow malevolent entities to slip through into your bedroom. Wealthy Victorian households employed servants specifically to cover and uncover mirrors at appropriate times, treating these reflective surfaces with the same reverence they might show a loaded pistol. The mirror covering ritual wasn't merely about nighttime protection. Each morning, you must approach your reflection with caution, whispering a protective prayer before drawing away the cloth. Some Victorian ladies would place a small cross or religious medal against the mirror's surface overnight, believing that divine symbols could purify any supernatural contamination that might have accumulated during the dark hours. If you accidentally glimpsed your reflection before completing these protective measures, the entire day might be cursed with minor disasters. Spilled tea, torn stockings, or worse, unexpected visits from disagreeable relatives. As you pad toward the wash basin, you notice small piles of salt at strategic points around the room, near the doorway, beneath the window, at the foot of your bed. These aren't accidents or signs of sloppy housekeeping. Salt, with its purifying properties and resistance to decay, formed the first line of defence against supernatural intrusion. Victorian housewives would rise before dawn to refresh these protective barriers, sprinkling fresh salt while murmuring quiet prayers or incantations passed down from their grandmothers. The salt must be replaced weekly, or its protective power would fade, leaving the household vulnerable to whatever malevolent influences prowled the neighbourhood after sunset. The quality of salt mattered tremendously in these rituals. Sea salt, blessed by natural forces, held more power than common table salt. Some families would journey to coastal regions specifically to collect salt from tidal pools, believing that water touched by moonlight carried extra protective properties. Kitchen salt that had been accidentally spilled and swept up was considered contaminated and useless for spiritual defense. Only virgin salt, never touched by careless hands, could form effective barriers against the supernatural. The breakfast ritual unfolds with mathematical precision. You sit at a table where bread is never placed upside down. Such carelessness invites starvation and misfortune. The tea leaves in your cup aren't just leaves. They're a complex divination system that reveals the day's hidden dangers. Swirling patterns of soggy botanical matter become maps of your future. Read with the same seriousness that modern meteorologists study weather patterns. A cluster of leaves near the rim suggests visitors arriving soon, while leaves settling at the bottom warn of troubles brewing beneath the surface of your peaceful existence. The breakfast table itself becomes a carefully orchestrated supernatural battlefield. Knives must never be crossed. Such arrangements create invisible wounds in the fabric of domestic harmony. Spilled milk cannot simply be wiped away. It must be thrown over the left shoulder to prevent financial disaster. Even the arrangement of your morning eggs carries meaning. If an egg cracks in an unfortunate pattern while being prepared, wise housewives would immediately bury the shell fragments in the garden to prevent the bad luck from spreading to other aspects of the household. Sugar, that precious commodity, requires especially careful handling during morning rituals. You must never stir your tea counterclockwise. Such action reverses fortune and invites poverty into your home. The spoon used for stirring must be placed carefully beside the cup, never across it, as crossed utensils symbolize conflict and argument. Some Victorian families maintained special silver spoons used only for morning tea, believing that precious metals enhanced the protective properties of their breakfast rituals. Historians still argue whether these breakfast superstitions originated from ancient Celtic practices or emerged as Victorian adaptations of older European folk beliefs. What remains undisputed is their universal adoption across social classes. Even the most scientifically minded Victorian gentleman might secretly arrange his morning cutlery in protective patterns, while publicly scoffing at such primitive nonsense. Archaeological evidence from Victorian household middens reveals that broken crockery was often buried rather than simply discarded, suggesting that even practical disposal methods carried supernatural significance. You step outside into the bustling street, but the supernatural precautions follow you. Your left foot must cross the threshold first. Right foot brings bad luck that could plague your entire day. The iron horseshoes nailed above doorways aren't decorative. They're spiritual armor plating. Iron, cold and unyielding, was thought to burn supernatural entities on contact, creating safe passages through a world teeming with invisible threats. The positioning of these protective horseshoes followed strict rules that Victorian householders memorized like multiplication tables. Points must face upward to catch and hold good fortune. Points downward would drain luck from the household like water from a punctured bucket. The horseshoe must be nailed with exactly 7 nails. Fewer provided insufficient protection, while more might anger the supernatural forces you were trying to appease. Used horseshoes, worn smooth by actual horses, held more power than new ones, as they had absorbed the protective essence of living animals. Walking through Victorian London, you notice that every respectable household displays some form of protective symbol. Rowan branches hang from windowsills, their red berries like drops of blood designed to ward off witchcraft. Peculiar arrangements of crossed sticks appear near garden gates. These aren't artistic statements, but carefully constructed barriers against the evil eye. Some houses sport small iron bells that ring softly in the morning breeze, their chiming meant to confuse and repel any spirits that might be following you home from the marketplace. The Victorian obsession with morning rituals reflected deeper anxieties about controlling an increasingly unpredictable world. As industrialization transformed daily life with unprecedented speed, people clung to supernatural practices that promised some measure of influence over fate. If you could just remember to throw spilled salt over your left shoulder, perhaps you could prevent your husband's business from failing. If you carefully avoided cracks in the pavement, maybe your children wouldn't fall ill with the cholera that periodically swept through the city's crowded neighbourhoods. Your morning routine concludes with one final protective gesture, touching a piece of iron before leaving the house. The sun climbs higher, burning away the morning mist. But the supernatural landscape remains as real and navigable as the cobblestone streets beneath your feet. The moment you step beyond your iron-protected threshold, the Victorian world reveals its hidden language of supernatural warnings. You walk through streets where every sound carries prophetic weight, where the flutter of wings overhead might herald death, and where the simple act of hearing a clock strike at the wrong moment could seal your fate for the coming week. This isn't paranoia. This is survival in a world where omens lurk in every shadow, and death announces its approach through a symphony of seemingly innocent everyday sounds. You pause on the cobblestone street as a magpie lands on the lamppost ahead. Your heart quickens, not from the beauty of its black and white plumage, but from the ancient counting rhyme that every Victorian child learned by heart. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy. A single magpie perched alone means grief approaches your household. You scan the rooftops desperately, hoping to spot its mate, because 2 magpies together would transform this ominous encounter into a promise of happiness. Finding none, you quickly tip your hat to the solitary bird, a gesture of respect that might convince it to spare you its darkest prophecies. The magpie superstition runs so deep in Victorian consciousness that respectable businessmen have been known to turn around and return home upon seeing a lone magpie on their way to important meetings. Church records from the period document cases of weddings postponed because magpies appeared in unlucky numbers during the procession to the altar. Even Queen Victoria herself reportedly consulted court naturalists about magpie sightings before making important royal decisions, though the palace officially denied such consultations ever occurred. The bird's intelligence only reinforced these beliefs. Their ability to recognize individual human faces suggested they might indeed be supernatural messengers capable of remembering which households had treated them with proper respect. As you continue down the street, the morning sounds of the city take on sinister significance. A dog howling in the distance makes you shiver, not from cold, but from the knowledge that dogs can sense approaching death days before it arrives. Victorian families would pay careful attention to their pets' behaviour, watching for signs that supernatural visitors might be prowling nearby. A dog that suddenly refused to enter a particular room, or a cat that hissed at empty corners, warned of invisible presences that human senses couldn't detect. Some households kept detailed journals documenting their animals' strange behaviours, believing that patterns might emerge to help predict which family members faced the greatest spiritual danger. The most unsettling canine behaviour involved dogs that howled while staring at specific family members. This direct attention meant death had marked that person for the collection within the coming month. Desperate families would sometimes relocate the targeted individual to distant relatives' homes, hoping to confuse death's supernatural tracking system. Pet cemeteries from the Victorian era contain numerous graves of dogs that were euthanized after delivering such dire predictions. Owners feared that animals capable of seeing death might become permanent conduits for supernatural communication. The church bells beginning their morning chimes create a moment of either comfort or terror, depending on how many times they ring. If the bells toll an even number, your day will unfold smoothly. An odd number warns of complications ahead, missed appointments, unexpected bills, or unwelcome news arriving by afternoon post. Some Victorians would actually count bell tolls on their fingers, keeping careful tallies throughout the day to predict when misfortune might strike. Households near churches often kept detailed logs of bell patterns, believing that careful record-keeping could reveal larger supernatural patterns governing their neighbourhood's fate. Church bell interpretation required sophisticated understanding that separated casual believers from serious practitioners. The time of day when bells rang affected their meaning. Morning bells carried messages about new beginnings, while evening bells warned about endings and conclusions. The pitch and quality of the sound mattered too. Clear, bright ringing promised good fortune, while muffled or discordant tones suggested spiritual interference from malevolent forces. Some Victorian families would adjust their daily schedules based entirely on bell predictions, postponing important activities when the morning chimes delivered unfavourable omens. You notice an elderly woman across the street suddenly stop walking and press her hand to her chest. She's heard it too. The distinctive tap-tap-tapping that makes every Victorian's blood run cold. Somewhere in the walls of the buildings around you. The Deathwatch beetle is at work. This tiny insect, boring through wooden beams, produces a rhythmic ticking sound that folklore has transformed into time's own countdown to mortality. The beetle's tapping supposedly marks the remaining hours in someone's life, though no one can predict whose life hangs in the balance. Historians still argue whether the Deathwatch beetle superstition originated from Celtic death omens or developed independently during the medieval period. What's certain is that Victorian families would evacuate rooms where Deathwatch beetles could be heard, sometimes abandoning entire houses until the tapping stopped. Pest control companies of the era made fortunes not just from eliminating the insects, but from providing certificates guaranteeing that homes were free from these harbingers of doom. The beetles' nocturnal activity patterns only intensified the fear. Their tapping grew loudest during the quiet hours when death traditionally made its rounds. The morning brings other auditory warnings that you've learned to interpret with scholarly precision. A robin singing outside your bedroom window before dawn means someone in your household will receive important news before sunset. But a robin tapping against glass warns of death attempting to enter the home. You must immediately open all windows and doors to allow the trapped spirit to escape, or risk having it remain as a permanent ghostly resident. The robin's red breast, according to the Victorian folklore, was stained with Christ's blood, giving these birds special authority as messengers between the living and divine realms. Robins that built nests near houses carried particularly complex meanings that required careful interpretation. A nest built on the sunny side of a building promised prosperity and healthy children. Nests constructed in shadowy areas warned of financial difficulties and family illnesses approaching with the changing seasons. If robins abandoned a nest before their eggs hatched, the household faced immediate danger that required protective countermeasures, extra salt barriers, blessed candles, and prayers offered at sunrise and sunset until the threat passed. Crows present their own complex interpretive system that governs major life decisions. 3 crows flying together in the same direction indicate a funeral procession will soon pass through your neighbourhood. 4 crows circling overhead suggest that someone you know is speaking ill of you at this very moment. A murder of crows gathering in unusual numbers, more than a dozen, warns of approaching plague or other widespread calamity. Victorian newspapers regularly published crow-counting guides, treating these interpretations as seriously as weather forecasts. Complete with seasonal adjustments for migration patterns, that might affect the accuracy of corvid prophecies. The intelligence of crows added credibility into their supernatural reputation. These birds could learn individual human faces, remember kindnesses and slights, and even teach their offspring to recognize specific people. When crows followed particular individuals through city streets, Victorians interpreted this behavior as confirmation that supernatural forces had marked those people for special attention, either protection or persecution, depending on how the person had previously treated the bird messengers. Even household sounds carry supernatural significance that affects your daily decisions. Chairs creaking without anyone sitting in them announce the arrival of invisible visitors, deceased relatives checking on their living family members. The sound of footsteps in empty rooms upstairs means your guardian angel is pacing, worried about dangers you haven't yet recognized. 3 distinct knocks with no one at the door herald either very good news or very bad news, arriving within 3 days, though determining which requires careful attention to additional omens throughout the interim period. The timing and rhythm of the mysterious household sounds provided additional layers of meaning that skilled practitioners could decode like musical compositions. Single knocks suggested gentle spirits seeking attention. Rapid series of knocks indicated urgency, supernatural entities trying to warn about immediate physical dangers. Slow, deliberate knocking patterns meant deceased family members were attempting to communicate specific messages that required patience and careful listening to understand fully. As the morning progresses and you navigate this landscape of prophetic sounds, you realize that death isn't just an eventual destination for Victorians. It's a constant travelling companion, announcing its presence through every creaking board and whistling wind, demanding acknowledgement and respect from those still breathing. Your fingers automatically reach for the locket at your throat as you walk through the Victorian morning, feeling the smooth curve of gold that contains something far more precious than any gemstone. Inside this delicate piece of jewellery lies a carefully braided lock of your deceased mother's hair, woven with strands from your late infant brother, who lived only 3 precious weeks. This isn't mere sentimentality. This is supernatural technology that allows you to maintain active communication with the spirit world while navigating the dangerous territory of daily life among the living. Victorian mourning jewellery represents perhaps the most intimate intersection of death and daily wear in human history. You examine the intricate piece around your neck, noting how the hair has been arranged in patterns that spell out mother in flowing script, each letter formed from individual strands that once grew from her beloved scalp. The hair was collected during her final illness, when she was still conscious enough to bless its intended purpose, protecting her surviving children from beyond the grave through constant physical contact with her earthly remains. The process of creating mourning jewellery required skills that blurred the line between craftsmanship and necromancy. Specialised artisans, known as hair workers, operated workshops throughout London, where bereaved families brought locks from their departed loved ones. These craftsmen could weave human hair into elaborate patterns that resembled delicate lacework, or they could shape it into 3-dimensional flowers that seemed to bloom with supernatural life. The most skilled hair workers claimed they could capture not just the physical essence of the deceased, but also fragments of their personality and spiritual energy within the jewellery's complex braided patterns. You pass a shop window displaying an array of mourning brooches, each one a tiny masterpiece of memorial art that would make modern jewellers weep with envy. Behind the glass, you see lockets containing painted miniatures surrounded by borders of braided hair from multiple family members, grandmother's silver strands intertwined with grandfather's brown locks. creating protective barriers around painted portraits that seem to watch passers-by with knowing eyes. Some pieces incorporate hair from entire families spanning 3 generations, creating ancestral talismans that carried the combined spiritual weight of numerous protective spirits. The most elaborate pieces combined hair with other death-related materials to amplify their supernatural potency. Tears, carefully collected during funeral services and allowed to crystallize into hard, clear droplets, were set like diamonds among the woven hair patterns. These tear gems supposedly retained the emotional intensity of grief, creating jewelry that could channel sorrow into spiritual protection. Some mourning pieces incorporated ground bone meal mixed with special adhesives, allowing the deceased's physical remains to become permanent parts of jewelry that their survivors would wear daily. Historians still argue whether Victorian mourning jewelry evolved from medieval reliquary traditions or emerged as a uniquely modern response to industrialization's disruption of traditional burial practices. What remains undisputed is the extraordinary technical sophistication these pieces achieved, with some brooches containing hair from dozens of individuals arranged in patterns so complex they required magnifying glasses to fully appreciate their intricate beauty. Children's mourning jewellery presented particularly heartbreaking examples of Victorian death culture's intersection with supernatural belief. You notice a young girl across the street wearing a simple pendant that contains hair from multiple infant siblings. Too many babies lost to diseases that modern medicine could easily prevent. Her pendant serves dual purposes, honouring the memory of children who barely lived, and providing protection against whatever malevolent forces claimed so many young lives in her household. The hair from infants was considered especially powerful for protective purposes, as children's spirits retained their innocence and purity even after death. The social protocols surrounding mourning jewellery created complex hierarchies that governed Victorian grief expression. Full mourning required wearing only jet or hair jewellery for the first year after losing a spouse or parent. Half mourning allowed limited amounts of gold or silver to be incorporated with the hair, while quarter mourning permitted more decorative elements that gradually transitioned survivors back toward normal jewellery wearing. Violating these protocols wasn't just socially awkward, it risked offending the deceased spirits whose hair you carried, potentially transforming protective talismans into sources of supernatural punishment. Women's mourning jewellery often incorporated mechanical elements that allowed the pieces to transform based on the wearer's spiritual needs. Lockets designed with secret compartments could hold multiple hair samples that could be exchanged depending on which deceased family member's protection seemed most relevant to current circumstances. Some brooches featured rotating panels that could display different hair arrangements, public patterns for social occasions, and private patterns for intimate moments when direct spiritual communication was desired. The hair itself required careful preparation before it could be incorporated into jewellery designs. Fresh hair from the recently deceased was considered most powerful, but hair collected during lifetime illnesses also carried significant spiritual weight. The hair had to be cleaned with specific solutions that wouldn't damage its supernatural properties, then sorted by colour and texture to create the desired visual effects. Some families would mix hair from multiple relatives to create custom blends that represented their entire ancestral lineage compressed into a single protective talisman. Mourning rings represented another category of hair jewellery that served specific supernatural functions in Victorian society. These rings, worn on designated fingers according to the relationship with the deceased, allowed wearers to channel spiritual energy through direct skin contact with the preserved hair, Wedding rings incorporating hair from deceased spouses supposedly maintained the marriage bond beyond death, allowing surviving partners to continue receiving guidance and protection from their spiritual husbands or wives. Some widows reported feeling actual warmth from their mourning rings during moments of crisis, as if their deceased spouses were literally reaching across the veil to offer comfort. The most unusual mourning jewellery incorporated hair from pets, particularly dogs and cats that had demonstrated supernatural sensitivity during their lifetimes, animals that had successfully warned families about approaching death, or had shown unusual ability to detect spiritual presences, were memorialized in special pendants that supposedly retained their protective instincts. These pet memorial pieces were often worn by children who were considered more vulnerable to supernatural threats and therefore needed additional layers of spiritual protection. Men's mourning jewellery followed different conventions but served equally important supernatural purposes. Mourning cufflinks, watch chains, and tie pins allowed Victorian gentlemen to carry protective hair samples without appearing feminine or emotionally excessive. These masculine pieces often incorporated hair into geometric patterns that resembled Masonic symbols or other fraternal organisation emblems, creating jewellery that satisfied both grief expression and social signalling requirements. The hair was often combined with black enamel or jet to create stark, dramatic effects that announced the wearer's loss while maintaining appropriate masculine dignity. Some Victorian mourning jewellery incorporated mechanical elements that created movement, supposedly allowing the preserved hair to continue growing through spiritual influence. These pieces featured tiny springs or clockwork mechanisms that would slowly shift hair arrangements over time, creating jewellery that changed appearance as the wearer's relationship with the deceased evolved from acute grief toward acceptance and ongoing spiritual connection. The cumulative effect of wearing multiple pieces of mourning jewellery created Victorian individuals who carried entire supernatural support networks on their bodies, protected by the combined spiritual essence of numerous deceased family members whose hair continued providing guidance and protection long after their physical forms had returned to dust. The gaslight flickers against heavy velvet curtains as you enter Mrs. Pemberton's respectable parlour this evening, where 12 distinguished members of Victorian society have gathered around a circular mahogany table that will soon become a stage for supernatural theatre. You take your assigned seat, feeling the polished wood beneath your palms, unaware that this innocent piece of furniture is about to transform into a conduit between worlds, dancing and spinning under the supposed influence of spirits desperate to communicate with the living. Table turning, or table tipping as some prefer to call it, has swept through Victorian England like a contagious fever, infecting drawing rooms from humble cottages to aristocratic mansions. Tonight's gathering includes a banker, 2 clergymen, a physician, and several prominent ladies whose reputations would normally shield them from accusations of dabbling in the occult. Yet here they sit, hands placed flat on the table's surface, fingers barely touching those of their neighbours, creating a human chain that supposedly channels spiritual energy with scientific precision. The medium, Mrs. Blackwood, has no crystal ball or dramatic robes. She appears as respectable as any church-going matron, which only adds to her credibility among sceptical participants. She explains the evening's procedure with the same matter-of-fact tone you might expect from a piano instructor outlining finger exercises. Everyone must maintain light contact with the table surface, allowing their natural psychic energy to flow freely. No pressure, no deliberate movement, just patient waiting for the spirits to manifest their presence through the furniture's mysterious animation. As the séance begins, you feel a subtle vibration through the wood, so faint you almost dismiss it as imagination. But gradually, the tremors strengthen, and the massive table begins to rock gently from side to side, as if breathing. Mrs. Blackwood announces that spirits are gathering, drawn by the combined psychic energy of tonight's participants. The table's movement will spell out messages, 1 tap for the letter A, 2 taps for B, and so forth through the alphabet, creating a laborious but allegedly reliable communication system with the beyond. Historians still argue whether table turning represents genuine supernatural phenomena, collective unconscious muscular movements, or deliberate fraud perpetrated by skilled performers. What remains undisputed is its widespread acceptance among educated Victorians who approach these séances with the same scientific curiosity they brought to studying electricity or steam engines. Even prominent researchers like physicist Michael Faraday conducted serious investigations into table turning, ultimately concluding that unconscious muscular pressure from participants caused the movements. Though this explanation satisfied neither believers nor skeptics, the table suddenly lurches to the left, causing several participants to gasp in surprise. Mrs. Blackwood interprets this dramatic movement as confirmation that a particularly powerful spirit has joined tonight's gathering. She begins asking questions, and the table responds with calculated taps that gradually spell out a message. Beware the stranger in your midst. A chill runs through the group as everyone glances suspiciously at their neighbours, wondering which among them might have attracted malevolent spiritual attention. The phenomenon of table turning emerged from a curious blend of spiritualism and Victorian society's fascination with mechanical precision. Tables, being functional furniture that normally remained stationary, seemed ideal for demonstrating supernatural intervention in the physical world. When a heavy wooden table began moving without apparent cause, the evidence appeared undeniable. Some force beyond human strength was manipulating matter according to intelligent purpose. The fact that multiple witnesses observed these movements simultaneously lent credibility that individual hallucinations couldn't achieve. Different types of tables produced varying supernatural effects that serious practitioners learned to interpret like musical instruments. Round tables supposedly facilitated smoother spiritual communication, as their circular shape allowed energy to flow continuously among participants without interruption. Square tables created more dramatic movements but often delivered confused or contradictory messages, as if the geometric angles interfered with proper spiritual transmission. Antique tables with histories of previous owners were considered most receptive to supernatural influence, particularly if someone had died while using them for writing letters or conducting business. As the evening progresses, the table's behaviour becomes increasingly theatrical. It rises completely off the floor, balancing on 2 legs while maintaining perfect stability despite the apparent impossibility of such positioning. Mrs. Blackwood explains that levitation demonstrates the spirit's growing comfort with tonight's gathering. They are beginning to trust the participants enough to display their full supernatural capabilities. Several ladies fan themselves nervously, while the gentlemen lean forward with scientific interest, trying to detect any hint of trickery in the table's impossible aerial dance. The social implications of table turning created fascinating contradictions within Victorian propriety. These séances provided acceptable venues for physical contact between unrelated men and women, as hand-holding became spiritually necessary rather than socially inappropriate. The darkness required for optimal spiritual communication also allowed emotional expressions that daylight propriety normally suppressed. Tears, gasps, and even fainting spells were expected responses to supernatural encounters, giving participants permission to display feelings that that ordinary social situations would condemn as excessive or unseemly. Children's participation in table turning presented particular challenges for Victorian families concerned about protecting young minds from supernatural corruption. Some parents believed that children's natural innocence made them ideal spiritual mediums, capable of channeling communications that adult skepticism might block. Others worried that exposure to spirit messages could damage developing minds or invite malevolent entities to target vulnerable young souls. Compromise solutions emerged, allowing children to observe séances without directly participating, letting them witness supernatural phenomena while maintaining protective distance from potential spiritual dangers. The table suddenly begins spelling out personal messages for individual participants, revealing intimate details about their private lives that supposedly only deceased relatives could know. Mrs. Pemberton learns that her late husband approves of her decision to sell his pocket watch. The banker receives warnings about a business investment that his deceased father considers unwise. These personalized communications transform the evening from general entertainment into deeply emotional encounters with mortality, grief, and the persistent hope that death doesn't truly separate us from those we love. Professional mediums like Mrs. Blackwood developed sophisticated techniques for reading their audiences and delivering convincing supernatural performances. They studied obituaries, society columns, and local gossip to gather information about potential clients' deceased relatives. During séances, subtle observation of participants' reactions helped them craft messages that appeared remarkably accurate. The collaborative nature of table turning also meant that participants often unconsciously provided information through their questions and comments, allowing skilled mediums to weave this intelligence into seemingly supernatural revelations. The furniture itself became a crucial component in successful table-turning performances. Tables had to be selected for optimal balance and mobility, allowing them to move responsively under minimal pressure while appearing to move independently. Some professional mediums invested in specially constructed tables with hidden mechanisms that could create dramatic effects, concealed weights that shifted position, or springs that could suddenly release to create startling movements. However, many genuine believers insisted that any mechanical assistance would interfere with authentic spiritual communication, preferring simple wooden tables with no modifications. As midnight approaches and the séance reaches its climax, the table delivers one final dramatic performance, spinning completely around while maintaining perfect stability. Mrs. Blackwood announces that the spirits are departing, satisfied with tonight's communication, but warning participants to remember the messages they've received. The table gradually settles into normal stillness, leaving everyone to wonder whether they've witnessed genuine supernatural phenomena or simply experienced the power of collective belief to transform ordinary furniture into extraordinary spiritual theatre. The evening concludes with participants exchanging thoughtful glances and quiet promises to consider the spiritual guidance they've received, while the innocent mahogany table sits silent in the flickering gaslight, keeping its secrets locked within polished wood that has somehow bridged the impossible gap between life and death. Your Victorian garden unfolds before you like a supernatural battlefield disguised as domestic tranquility, where every bloom and branch carries either blessing or curse, and where a single misplaced flower might invite death through your front door before tea time. You pause at the garden gate, surveying the carefully planned landscape that serves dual purposes as both aesthetic pleasure and spiritual protection. Each plant chosen not just for beauty, but for its ability to guard your household against invisible threats that prowl the neighbourhood seeking vulnerable homes to infiltrate. The white roses climbing your garden wall aren't simply decorative. They form the first line of supernatural defence around your property. White flowers, particularly roses, were believed to purify negative energy and create barriers that malevolent spirits couldn't cross. But the colour of roses matters tremendously in Victorian supernatural botany. Red roses planted near the house invite passion and violence, while yellow roses bring jealousy and betrayal. Pink roses offer gentle protection for young unmarried daughters, but only if planted on the eastern side of the garden, where morning sunlight can bless them with divine energy. You bend to examine the rosemary hedge that borders your kitchen garden, inhaling its sharp, memorable fragrance that serves purposes far beyond culinary seasoning. Rosemary, the herb of remembrance, supposedly allows communication with deceased family members when planted in specific patterns around the home. The arrangement matters crucially. Rosemary planted in a perfect circle creates a portal for friendly spirits, while scattered plantings invite confusion and mixed supernatural messages that might lead you astray when seeking guidance from beyond. The rosemary requires careful maintenance to preserve its protective properties. If the plants die unexpectedly, this warns that malevolent forces have gained strength in your neighbourhood and are actively working to breach your botanical defences. Yellowing leaves suggest that someone in your household harbours secret resentments that weaken the plant's spiritual effectiveness. Some Victorian gardeners would whisper prayers to their rosemary bushes each morning, believing that regular spiritual communion strengthened the plant's supernatural abilities. Near the garden's centre, you notice the rowan tree that dominates the landscape with its distinctive red berries gleaming like drops of blood in the morning light. Rowan trees, also called mountain ash, represent perhaps the most powerful protective flora in the Victorian supernatural arsenal. The tree's berries, bark, and wood all contain defensive properties against witchcraft, evil spirits, and malicious curses directed toward your family. But rowan protection comes with strict rules. You must never cut living branches except during specific moon phases, and fallen branches must be gathered immediately before they lose their potency. Historians still argue whether rowan tree superstitions originated from ancient Celtic druidic practices or developed independently across multiple European cultures. What's certain is that Victorian households would pay premium prices for rowan saplings, and property values actually increased for homes with mature rowan trees on their grounds. Insurance companies of the era even offered reduced premiums for houses protected by established rowan groves, treating supernatural protection as seriously as they considered fire prevention or flood controls. The herb garden near your kitchen window contains plants whose supernatural properties rival their culinary applications. Sage, when burned in small bundles, cleanses rooms of negative spiritual energy left behind by quarrelsome visitors or family arguments. Thyme strengthens courage and provides protection during childbirth, but pregnant women must avoid harvesting it personally, as direct contact might confuse the plant's protective instincts. Lavender offers peaceful sleep and protection from nightmares, but only if the plants are watered with rainwater collected during thunderstorms, when the lightning has blessed it with divine energy. The placement of herbs requires sophisticated understanding of their interactive spiritual effects. Basil planted too close to rue creates supernatural conflicts that can manifest as household accidents or family quarrels. Mint spreads aggressively not just through root systems, but also through spiritual contamination that can overwhelm other protective plants if not carefully contained. Some Victorian gardeners maintain detailed charts tracking their herbs' supernatural compatibility, treating garden planning like military strategy designed to repel invisible invaders. At the garden's shadowy edges, you maintain plants that serve more ominous purposes than protection. Foxglove, with its tall spikes of purple flowers, supposedly allows communication with fairy folk, but these conversations carry enormous risks. Fairies might offer valuable information about hidden dangers or future opportunities, but they demand payment in forms that could bankrupt your household or endanger your children's souls. The foxglove must be approached with elaborate rituals and protective prayers, and only during specific lunar phases when fairy magic runs weakest. Belladonna grows in a carefully fenced corner where children and pets cannot accidentally encounter its deadly beauty. This plant's supernatural applications terrify even experienced practitioners. Its berries can induce prophetic visions that reveal future events, but the line between spiritual enlightenment and fatal poisoning requires precision that few Victorian gardeners possess. Some families maintain belladonna purely as insurance against supernatural emergencies, hoping they'll never need to test its dangerous properties, but comforted by having access to such powerful botanical tools. The seasonal care of supernatural plants follows complex calendars that blend agricultural wisdom with mystical timing. Spring planting must align with specific astrological configurations to ensure maximum protective potency. Summer requires vigilant monitoring for signs that supernatural parasites might be draining the plant's spiritual energy. Autumn harvesting follows lunar phases, with different moon stages optimal for different types of supernatural preservation. Winter protection involves more than physical coverings. Special prayers and offerings ensure that dormant plants maintain their spiritual strength until spring awakening. Victorian garden. Design incorporated pathways that served supernatural navigation purposes beyond simple foot traffic. Curved paths confused evil spirits that supposedly could only travel in straight lines, while geometric garden layouts created sacred patterns that amplified the protective properties of individual plants. Some wealthy families employed specialized garden designers who understood both horticultural science and supernatural botany, creating landscapes that functioned as comprehensive spiritual defense systems disguised as fashionable ornamental displays. The interaction between domestic animals and supernatural plants created additional layers of garden complexity that required careful management. Cats naturally gravitated towards the plants with protective properties, often sleeping beneath rowan trees or rolling in patches of sage, seemingly aware of their supernatural benefits. Dogs, however, might accidentally contaminate protective plants by urinating on them, neutralizing their spiritual effectiveness and requiring immediate purification rituals to restore the garden's defensive capabilities. Flower arrangements brought indoors from the supernatural garden carried their protective properties into the house, but required careful attention to avoid spiritual contamination. Flowers cut during inappropriate moon phases might invite rather than repel supernatural visitors. Mixed bouquets could create conflicting spiritual messages that confused both helpful and harmful entities. Some Victorian households employed specialized flower arrangers who understood the supernatural implications of domestic floral displays, ensuring that indoor decorations enhanced rather than undermined the garden's protective work. The garden's boundaries required constant maintenance to preserve their supernatural integrity. Fences and walls needed regular blessing with salt water and protective prayers to prevent spiritual erosion. Gates required iron reinforcement and specific opening rituals to ensure that only welcome entities could enter the protected garden space. Some families buried protective talismans at property corners, creating invisible barriers that complemented the visible botanical defences. As you complete your morning garden inspection, checking each plant for signs of supernatural health or spiritual contamination, you realise that this peaceful domestic space represents a complex supernatural ecosystem where beauty and protection intertwine like climbing roses around a cottage wall, creating sanctuary in a world where danger might bloom as easily as flowers. You step into the photographer's studio with a mixture of excitement and terror, knowing that this revolutionary new art of capturing images might also capture something far more precious and dangerous, your immortal soul itself. The photographer adjusts his mysterious apparatus behind a black cloth while you pose rigidly in an ornate chair, unaware that Victorian society believes this mechanical marvel can photograph not just your physical form, but also the spirits of deceased relatives who hover invisibly around living family members, sometimes revealing themselves in the developed images like ghostly accusations from beyond the grave. The photography studio feels like a temple dedicated to technological sorcery, with its strange chemical odours and arcane equipment that transforms light itself into permanent images through processes that seem to violate natural law. Mr. Whitmore, the photographer, explains that you must remain absolutely motionless for several minutes while his camera performs its magical work, capturing not just your appearance but potentially your spiritual essence in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The very concept terrifies many Victorians who worry that cameras might steal fragments of their souls with each exposure, leaving them spiritually diminished and vulnerable to supernatural attack. As you sit frozen in position, you notice other patrons examining recent photographs displayed around the studio, pointing excitedly at mysterious figures that appear in family portraits, translucent forms standing behind posed subjects, faces emerging from shadows where no living person was present during the exposure. These spirit photographs have become Victorian society's most compelling evidence for life after death, offering visual proof that deceased relatives continue watching over their living families, sometimes appearing in photographs to deliver warnings or express approval of family decisions. The technical aspects of spirit photography fascinate both believers and skeptics who struggle to explain how ghostly images appear on photographic plates when no visible spirits were present during the sitting. Some photographers claim that camera lenses can capture spiritual vibrations invisible to human eyes, much like how telescopes reveal distant stars that naked eyes cannot see. The long exposure times required by early photography supposedly allow spirits enough time to partially materialize, becoming visible to photographic chemicals even when living witnesses detect nothing unusual in the studio during the session. Spirit photography studios employ specialized techniques designed to encourage supernatural manifestations during portrait sessions. Some photographers burn specific incenses that allegedly attract departed souls who want to communicate with living relatives. Others use mirrors positioned around the studio to create spiritual pathways that make it easier for ghosts to appear in photographs. The most dramatic practitioners claim they can summon specific deceased individuals by name, calling upon parents, spouses, or children who died tragically young and might be eager to demonstrate their continued existence. You watch nervously as Mr. Whitmore prepares his photographic plates, wondering if any deceased relatives might choose this moment to make their presence known through his supernatural technology. Your late grandfather, who died when you were barely old enough to remember his face, might appear standing behind your chair, offering posthumous approval of your recent engagement. Or perhaps your infant sister, who lived only 3 days before succumbing to fever will manifest as a glowing angelic presence confirming that she watches over the family from heavenly realms. The cultural impact of spirit photography extends far beyond individual portrait sessions, influencing Victorian society's understanding of death, memory, and the invisible world that supposedly surrounds everyday life. Families treasure spirit photographs as precious heirlooms that prove their deceased loved ones remain accessible through technological intervention. These images provide comfort during grief, evidence for religious beliefs about afterlife, and social status symbols that demonstrate the family's connection to supernatural phenomena that less fortunate households cannot afford to document. Historians still argue whether spirit photography represents elaborate fraud perpetrated by unscrupulous photographers or genuine supernatural phenomena captured through technological accident. Many documented cases involved obvious double exposures, deliberate plate manipulation, or actors posing as spirits during carefully orchestrated deceptions. However, some spirit photographs display technical anomalies that skilled investigators cannot explain through known photographic techniques, suggesting that either Victorian photographers possess sophisticated fraud methods that modern experts cannot duplicate, or cameras occasionally captured images of phenomena that conventional science cannot explain. The economic aspects of spirit photography create interesting insights into Victorian supernatural commerce. Photographers who specialised in spirit images charged premium prices for sessions that might or might not produce supernatural results. Some studios offered guarantees if no spirits appeared in your photographs, you could return for additional sessions at no extra charge. The most successful spirit photographers developed reputations for consistently producing ghostly images, attracting wealthy clients from across England who travelled specifically to have their portraits taken by photographers with proven supernatural abilities. As your photographic session continues, Mr. Whitmore emerges from beneath his black cloth and announces that the exposure is complete. Now comes the anxious waiting period while he develops the photographic plate in his darkroom, using chemical processes that seem as mysterious as any alchemical formula. You pace nervously around the studio, examining other customers' spirit photographs and wondering what supernatural revelations your own portrait might contain. The anticipation feels unbearable. Will your photograph show only your solitary figure, or will ghostly relatives crowd around your chair like invisible guardians finally made visible? The development process itself becomes a supernatural event as Mr. Whitmore works in his chemical-scented darkroom, slowly coaxing images from treated glass plates, using solutions that transform invisible light into visible reality. Some photographers claim they can influence spirit manifestations during development by burning specific herbs or reciting particular prayers while the images gradually appear in their chemical baths. The darkroom's mysterious atmosphere, with its red-tinted lighting and arcane equipment, resembles a wizard's laboratory where technology and magic merge to reveal hidden truths about the invisible world. Different types of spirit photographs carry distinct meanings that experienced practitioners learn to interpret like supernatural diagnostics. Clear, well-defined spirit images suggest that the deceased person maintains strong connections to living family members and feels comfortable appearing in photographs. Blurry or partially visible spirits indicate souls who are struggling to communicate or who face spiritual obstacles that interfere with their earthly manifestations. Multiple spirits appearing in single photographs might represent family reunions occurring in the supernatural realm, or they could warn of impending deaths that will soon reunite living subjects with their deceased relatives. Children's spirit photographs present particularly poignant examples of Victorian death culture intersecting with technological innovation. Families who lost multiple infants to disease would commission special sessions hoping to see their deceased children gathered around surviving siblings, offering visual proof that death hadn't truly separated the family. Some spirit photographs allegedly show deceased children aging normally in the afterlife, appearing older in recent photographs than they were at the time of death, suggesting that spiritual existence includes continued growth and development beyond physical mortality. The technical equipment used in spirit photography studios incorporates both scientific precision and supernatural accommodation. Cameras require careful calibration to capture spiritual vibrations that might exist at different frequencies than normal light. Some photographers use specially treated lenses that they claim enhance sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. The chemical solutions used for developing spirit photographs often include unusual additives, silver compounds blessed by clergy, or water collected from holy wells that supposedly improve the plate's ability to record ghostly images. Mr. Whitmore finally emerges from his darkroom carrying your completed photograph, and you hold your breath as he reveals the results of this supernatural experiment. The image shows your posed figure with startling clarity, but there, standing just behind your left shoulder, is an unmistakable translucent form that makes your heart race with recognition, a beloved face from your past, captured by technology that has somehow bridged the impossible gap between life and death. You wake on your wedding morning to a world transformed into a supernatural minefield where every detail of your dress, every flower in your bouquet, and every step toward the altar could either bless your marriage with decades of happiness or curse it with misery, betrayal, and early widowhood. The ivory silk gown hanging in your wardrobe isn't simply a garment. It's a complex talisman whose colour, fabric, and construction must align perfectly with ancient traditions that protect brides from the malevolent spirits who supposedly gather during wedding ceremonies, drawn by the powerful emotions and life-changing energy that make marriage such a vulnerable moment for supernatural interference. Your mother fusses nervously around you as you prepare for the most spiritually dangerous day of your life, checking and rechecking the protective elements woven into every aspect of your bridal ensemble. The pearl buttons on your gown weren't chosen for beauty alone. Pearls, born from the ocean's depths, carry protective properties against tears and sorrow that might otherwise flood your married life. Each button must be sewn with specific stitches and blessed with quiet prayers to ensure the pearls maintain their supernatural effectiveness throughout the ceremony and beyond. The wedding dress colour carries such profound supernatural significance that choosing incorrectly could doom your marriage before the ceremony concludes. White represents purity and divine protection, making it the safest choice for brides seeking long, peaceful marriages. Blue brings heavenly blessings and ensures your husband's faithfulness throughout your union. Yellow attracts wealth and prosperity, but warns of jealousy from other women who might work supernatural mischief against your happiness. Red, while beautiful, invites passion that burns too intensely, often consuming marriages in flames of adultery and violence within just a few years. The rhyme that guides Victorian brides through this crucial colour decision echoes through your mind like a protective incantation. Married in white, you will have chosen all right. Married in grey, you will go far away. Married in black, you will wish yourself back. Married in red, you will wish yourself dead. Married in green, ashamed to be seen. Married in blue, you will always be true. Married in pearl, you will live in a whirl. Married in yellow, ashamed of your fellow. Your veil requires equally careful supernatural consideration, as this delicate fabric creates a barrier between you and any evil spirits who might attempt to possess your body during the vulnerable moments of exchanging vows. The veil must be made from fabric that has never touched the ground, ensuring its spiritual purity remains intact. Some families pass down wedding veils through multiple generations, believing that each successful marriage adds protective power to the fabric, creating heirloom veils so spiritually potent they practically guarantee marital happiness for future brides who wear them with proper reverence. Historians still argue whether wedding veil traditions originated from ancient Roman customs designed to confuse evil spirits, or developed independently as Christian adaptations of older protective rituals. What remains undisputed is the veil's crucial role in Victorian wedding supernatural protocol. Brides who married without veils faced dramatically higher rates of marital discord, early widowhood, and childlessness, though whether this correlation reflected supernatural punishment or social stigma remains a matter of scholarly debate. The wedding bouquet presents another layer of supernatural complexity that could determine your marriage's fate before you reach the altar. Each flower carries specific meanings that combine to create either protective blessings or dangerous curses, depending on your botanical choices. Orange blossoms represent fertility and eternal love, making them essential for brides who want children and lasting marriages. White roses symbolize pure love and divine protection, while red roses invoke passionate but potentially destructive emotions that might overwhelm your marriage with jealousy and conflict. Certain flowers must never appear in bridal bouquets regardless of their beauty or availability. Chrysanthemums, associated with death and mourning, predict early widowhood for any bride foolish enough to carry them down the aisle. Yellow flowers of any variety warn of infidelity and broken trust that will poison your marriage within the first year. Carnations, while lovely, invite poverty and financial struggles that could destroy even the strongest romantic bonds when economic pressures test your commitment to each other. The preparation of your bridal bouquet requires timing that aligns with supernatural forces governing marriage and fertility. Flowers must be cut during specific lunar phases to ensure maximum protective power. Waxing moon phases strengthen the bouquet's ability to attract marital blessings, while waning moon phases might drain the flower's positive energy before the ceremony begins. Some families employ specialized florists who understand both botanical beauty and supernatural botany, creating bouquets that serve as comprehensive protective talismans disguised as decorative accessories. Your wedding shoes hide beneath your gown but carry supernatural significance that affects your marriage's foundation as literally as they support your physical steps toward the altar. New shoes represent fresh beginnings and untainted possibilities for your married life, but they must be worn briefly before the wedding day to prevent supernatural forces from viewing your marriage as completely foreign territory. Old shoes carry the spiritual contamination of previous experiences that might interfere with your new relationship's development. The tradition of placing silver coins in your wedding shoes creates financial protection that supposedly ensures prosperity throughout your married life. The coins must be genuine silver, blessed by clergy, and placed in your left shoe specifically, the side associated with receiving blessings rather than giving them away. Some brides sew the coins permanently into their shoe linings, creating protective talismans they can wear throughout their marriages whenever they need extra supernatural assistance during difficult financial periods. Your wedding breakfast menu requires careful planning to avoid foods that might curse your marriage with specific types of misfortune. Salt, the universal protector against evil influences, must appear in every dish to prevent supernatural contamination of your celebration. Sugar ensures sweetness in your married life, but artificial sweeteners invite artificial happiness that won't sustain your relationship through genuine challenges. Bitter foods like unsweetened chocolate or strong coffee warn of bitter arguments that will plague your household, while sour foods predict financial difficulties that will test your marital bonds. The wedding cake itself becomes a supernatural focal point that requires elaborate protective protocols to prevent cursing your marriage through contaminated celebration food. The cake must be cut by both bride and groom together, with their hands joined on the knife handle, to ensure that your marriage's sweetness will be shared equally between partners. Dropping the knife during the ceremony warns of violent arguments ahead, while cutting the cake unevenly predicts that one spouse will dominate the marriage while the other suffers in submissive silence. The guest list for your wedding celebration affects the supernatural atmosphere surrounding your marriage ceremony, as each person brings their own spiritual energy that either blesses or threatens your union's future success. Inviting anyone who secretly opposes your marriage, rejected suitors, jealous relatives, or disapproving friends, risks introducing malevolent energy that could curse your relationship with ongoing conflict and eventual failure. Some Victorian families would secretly investigate potential wedding guests, ensuring that only those who genuinely supported the union would attend the ceremony. As you take your final steps as a single woman, walking towards the church where your future husband waits, you carry with you the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who understood that marriage represents more than legal contract or romantic commitment. It's a supernatural transformation that requires every possible protection against the invisible forces that would love nothing more than to destroy your happiness before it can properly begin. The church bells ring in the distance, calling you toward your destiny, while your mother whispers one final protective blessing over your bridal ensemble, praying that love will triumph over whatever supernatural challenges await your marriage in the mysterious years ahead. You cradle your newborn daughter against your chest while your Victorian household mobilizes around you like a supernatural army, implementing protective protocols designed to shield this tiny, vulnerable soul from fairy kidnapping, evil eye curses, and the countless invisible threats that supposedly target infants during their first crucial weeks of life. The baby's small face, perfect and peaceful in sleep, represents both ultimate blessing and maximum supernatural vulnerability, requiring constant vigilance from family members who understand that children under 1 year old remain partially connected to the spirit world, making them irresistible targets for otherworldly entities, Bulba seeking to steal innocent souls. Your mother-in-law arrives within hours of the birth, carrying a leather pouch filled with protective items that have safeguarded her family's children for 3 generations. Iron nails, blessed by the local priest, will be hammered into the nursery windowsill to prevent supernatural entry through vulnerable glass portals. A small horseshoe, positioned points upward above the cradle, creates a protective barrier that evil spirits cannot cross. Red ribbon, tied in specific knots around the baby's wrist, supposedly confuses malevolent fairies who might attempt to substitute your perfect child with one of their own sickly offspring. The changeling fear dominates Victorian child protection superstitions with terrifying intensity, as parents live in constant anxiety that fairy folk might steal their healthy babies and leave supernatural substitutes that appear normal but gradually reveal their otherworldly nature through strange behaviours, unusual growth patterns, or mysterious illnesses that resist all medical treatment. Changelings supposedly cry constantly, refuse normal food, display uncanny intelligence for their apparent age, or demonstrate supernatural abilities that mark them as fairy impostors rather than human children. Protection against changeling substitution requires elaborate rituals that begin immediately after birth and continue throughout the child's first year. The baby must never be left completely alone, even for moments. As fairies allegedly work with supernatural speed to complete their theft and substitution before anyone notices the switch, family members take shifts maintaining constant supervision, creating human barriers that supposedly prevent fairy access to vulnerable infants who haven't yet developed sufficient spiritual defenses to protect themselves. You learn the specific signs that warn of potential changeling activity in your neighborhood. Unusual numbers of butterflies gathering near houses with new babies, dogs refusing to enter certain rooms where infants sleep, or mirrors reflecting images that don't match what human eyes observe directly. These warning signs require immediate response, additional protective iron around the house, blessed salt sprinkled in doorways, and prayers offered at sunrise and sunset until the supernatural threat diminishes. Historians still argue whether changeling beliefs originated from medieval European folklore or developed as explanations for childhood diseases and developmental disabilities that parents couldn't otherwise understand. What's certain is that Victorian families invested enormous emotional and financial resources in changeling prevention, purchasing protective amulets, hiring specialized nurses trained in supernatural childcare, and sometimes relocating entire households to escape neighborhoods where changeling activity seemed particularly active. The evil eye represents another supernatural threat that requires constant vigilance to protect your innocent daughter from jealous or malevolent gazes that could curse her with illness, deformity, or death through concentrated negative attention from adults who harbor resentment against your family's happiness. Visitors who compliment your baby too enthusiastically, or who stare too intently at her beautiful features, might unconsciously direct evil eye energy toward your child, requiring immediate protective countermeasures to prevent supernatural damage. Blue beads, sewn into your daughter's clothing or hung above her cradle, supposedly deflect evil eye curses by reflecting negative energy back toward the source. Some families purchase elaborate evil eye talismans featuring painted eyes that stare back at potential curses, creating supernatural standoffs that neutralize malevolent gazes before they can harm innocent children. The most effective protection involves mirrors positioned strategically around the nursery, creating maze-like reflection patterns that confuse evil eye energy and prevent it from reaching its intended target. Religious protection methods complement these folk remedies through official church blessings that supposedly place divine shields around vulnerable infants. Holy water, sprinkled around the nursery and applied to the baby's forehead during daily prayers, creates consecrated space that evil spirits cannot violate. Baptism provides the ultimate supernatural protection by formally enrolling the child in divine protection programs, though some families worry that the ceremony itself attracts supernatural attention from entities eager to interfere with the soul's salvation. Your daughter's name selection required careful consideration of its supernatural implications, as certain names supposedly attract or repel spiritual attention based on their historical associations and mystical properties. Names of saints provide built-in divine protection through celestial patronage. Names derived from nature, rose, violet, lily, connect children to protective plant spirits that supposedly guard them throughout life. However, names associated with tragedy, ancient curses, or deceased family members who met unfortunate ends might transfer supernatural liabilities to innocent children who bear these compromised appellations. Feeding rituals surrounding your nursing baby incorporate protective elements designed to ensure that supernatural contamination doesn't enter her body through corrupted milk or tainted food. Nursing mothers must avoid certain foods that might weaken breast milk's natural protective properties, bitter herbs that could sour the milk's spiritual essence, or foods associated with death and decay that might transfer negative energy to nursing infants. Some families employ wet nurses specifically chosen for their proven supernatural resistance, believing that women with strong spiritual defenses produce milk with enhanced protective qualities. The baby's clothing serves protective functions beyond warmth and modesty, with specific colours, fabrics, and construction methods designed to create wearable supernatural armour. White clothing symbolises innocence and divine protection, making it the safest choice for vulnerable infants. Red garments supposedly confuse evil spirits by mimicking blood, though some practitioners warn that red might actually attract vampiric entities drawn to anything resembling vital life force. Handmade clothing carries more protective power than commercially produced garments, as the love and care invested during construction supposedly imbues the fabric with defensive spiritual energy. Sleep protection requires the most elaborate supernatural protocols, as sleeping children allegedly become particularly vulnerable to spiritual interference when their souls temporarily separate from their bodies during dreams. Iron objects placed around the cradle create protective barriers that evil spirits cannot cross. Protective herbs, lavender for peaceful sleep, sage for purification, rosemary for remembrance of divine protection, are sewn into small sachets hung near the baby's sleeping area. Some families maintain vigil lights that burn continuously throughout the night, believing that constant illumination prevents supernatural entities from approaching sleeping children under cover of darkness. The nursery window requires special attention as a potential entry point for supernatural threats that might fly, crawl, or simply materialize through vulnerable glass barriers, iron bars, while practical for preventing falls, also serve supernatural purposes by creating cage-like protection that spirits cannot penetrate. Protective symbols painted or carved around window frames, crosses, pentacles, ancient runic signs supposedly reinforce the barrier between indoor safety and outdoor supernatural dangers that prowl neighborhood streets seeking vulnerable targets. Your daughter's first smile, appearing around 6 weeks of age, marks a crucial supernatural milestone that signals her soul's increasing connection to the physical world and corresponding decrease in vulnerability to otherworldly threats. Some families celebrate this moment with thanksgiving prayers and protective offerings, while others use the occasion to gradually reduce the most intensive supernatural precautions as the child develops stronger natural defenses against spiritual interference. Visitors bearing gifts for your new daughter must be carefully screened for potential supernatural contamination that might transfer to your innocent child through cursed objects or malevolently enchanted toys. Handmade gifts carry the maker's spiritual energy, requiring evaluation of the giver's intentions and moral character. Store-bought toys might seem safer, but they lack the protective blessing that comes from being created specifically for your child by people who love her, leaving them spiritually neutral rather than positively protective. As the weeks pass and your daughter grows stronger, the constellation of protective measures surrounding her gradually evolves from crisis-level intensity toward long-term supernatural maintenance protocols that will shield her throughout childhood, ensuring that your precious gift remains safely human rather than becoming another casualty in the ongoing war between protective parents and the invisible forces that threaten innocent souls. You wake each morning in your Victorian household to the whispered presence of invisible residents who supposedly share your domestic space with the same sense of ownership you feel toward the parlour furniture and kitchen crockery, requiring daily negotiations between human occupants and supernatural entities who might bless your family with prosperity or curse you with perpetual misfortune depending on how respectfully you acknowledge their ancient territorial claims to hearth, threshold, and cellar. These household spirits, known by various names across different regions, brownies in Scotland, boggarts in northern England, house elves in Cornwall, demand recognition, appeasement, and careful management to maintain the delicate supernatural ecosystem that governs domestic tranquility. Your morning routine begins with leaving small offerings for the kitchen brownie, who supposedly assists with cooking, cleaning, and food preservation when properly honoured, but who might spoil milk, break crockery, and hide essential items when neglected or insulted by thoughtless family members who fail to appreciate supernatural domestic assistance. The offering ritual requires precision. Fresh bread crusts placed on the windowsill, never on plates, which might suggest you consider the brownie a mere pet rather than a valued household partner. Sweet cream left in a shallow dish near the hearth provides nourishment for spirits who work tirelessly throughout the night, completing household tasks that would otherwise burden the human family. The brownie's assistance manifests in countless small domestic miracles that Victorian families learn to recognize and appreciate, floors that somehow sweep themselves cleaner overnight, bread dough that rises perfectly despite inconsistent temperatures, fires that burn longer and warmer than the fuel should logically support. These helpful interventions save hours of daily labour and prevent domestic disasters that could threaten family health and financial stability, making brownie appeasement a practical investment rather than mere superstitious indulgence. However, brownies demand respect and proper treatment in exchange for their invaluable assistance. Observing their work directly insults their privacy and professional dignity, potentially causing them to abandon the household permanently or transform into malevolent poltergeists who dedicate themselves to domestic destruction rather than helpful cooperation. Children must be trained never to spy on household spirits, while adults learn to notice evidence of supernatural assistance without actually witnessing the spirits at work. The hearth spirit represents another category of household supernatural resident who governs fire, warmth, and family unity through careful maintenance of the central fireplace that serves as the home's spiritual heart. This entity requires daily acknowledgement through small rituals, the first flames of morning kindled with gratitude, ash scattered in protective patterns around the foundation, and careful attention to fire maintenance that demonstrates respect for the spirit's domain. Neglecting hearth spirit protocols results in fires that smoke excessively, refuse to light properly, or spread dangerous sparks that threaten to burn down the entire house. Seasonal offerings to hearth spirits follow traditional calendars that align domestic supernatural appeasement with agricultural cycles and religious observances. Christmas requires special feasts left burning overnight in the fireplace, creating supernatural banquets that honour the hearth spirit's year-long protection of family safety and warmth. Midsummer demands flower garlands hung around the mantelpiece, acknowledging the spirit's role in maintaining comfortable temperatures during the hot months when excessive heat might make indoor cooking dangerous or unbearable. The threshold guardian protects doorways, windows, and other vulnerable openings where supernatural threats might attempt to enter your domestic sanctuary. requiring daily recognition through protective rituals that maintain the barriers between safe indoor space and dangerous outdoor spiritual territory. Iron nails driven into door frames honour this guardian while providing physical reinforcement for supernatural protection. Salt lines across thresholds must be refreshed regularly to maintain their effectiveness, while protective herbs hung above doorways require replacement when they lose their potency. Historians still argue whether household spirit beliefs originated from ancient animistic traditions or developed as Victorian adaptations of pre-Christian religious practices that survived centuries of official suppression. What remains undisputed is their universal presence across social classes, with wealthy Victorian households employing specialised servants trained in supernatural protocol alongside traditional domestic duties, while working-class families integrated spirit appeasement into daily routines that already revolved around careful resource management and household maintenance. Different household spirits govern specific domestic domains with clearly defined responsibilities and territorial boundaries that must be respected to prevent supernatural conflicts that could disrupt entire families. The pantry spirit oversees food storage, preservation, and distribution, ensuring that supplies last through difficult periods while preventing spoilage that could threaten family nutrition. This spirit requires regular offerings of choice food items, the first fruits of each season, premium cuts of meat, or carefully prepared delicacies that demonstrate the family's appreciation for supernatural food management. Cellar spirits govern underground storage areas where wine, preserves, and root vegetables require protection from both natural decay and supernatural contamination that might spoil essential supplies during winter months when fresh food becomes unavailable. These spirits appreciate offerings of wine or ale poured directly onto cellar floors, creating libations that honour their guardianship while providing nourishment for entities who work in dark or damp conditions that would discourage most supernatural beings. The nursery spirit specialises in protecting children from supernatural threats while they sleep, requiring specific protocols that complement the physical protective measures parents implement around cribs and children's bedrooms. This spirit responds well to offerings of toys, sweets, and small trinkets that demonstrate the family's commitment to childhood happiness and safety. However, nursery spirits demand absolute quiet during children's sleeping hours, becoming vengeful if disturbed by loud conversations, heavy footsteps, or domestic arguments that might frighten young souls during their vulnerable dream states. Attic spirits govern the uppermost regions of Victorian houses, where family heirlooms, seasonal decorations, and accumulated memories require protection from both physical deterioration and supernatural contamination that might corrupt precious family artifacts. These elevated spirits prefer offerings of incense, dried flowers, and handwritten notes expressing gratitude for their guardianship of family history and treasured possessions. Some families create small shrines in their attics, dedicating sacred space specifically for spirit worship that acknowledges their supernatural residents' contributions to household harmony. Garden spirits bridge the gap between domestic and natural supernatural realms, requiring recognition of their role in maintaining the boundary between civilized household space and wild outdoor territory, where less friendly entities might attempt to approach your family's sanctuary. These spirits appreciate offerings of fresh flowers, seasonal fruits, and carefully tended garden plots that demonstrate respect for the natural world while maintaining clear distinctions between protected domestic space and potentially dangerous wilderness areas. The complexity of managing multiple household spirits simultaneously requires sophisticated understanding of supernatural hierarchy, territorial disputes, and personality conflicts that might arise when different spirits compete for dominance within the same domestic space. Experienced Victorian householders learn to recognize signs of spirit conflicts, unexplained accidents, recurring domestic problems, or atmospheric tension that makes family members uncomfortable in specific rooms, and develop intervention strategies that restore supernatural harmony through careful negotiation and appropriate offerings. The seasonal cycle of household spirit activity creates rhythmic patterns of supernatural intensity that wise families learn to anticipate and accommodate through adjusted domestic routines. Spring cleaning involves more than physical housework. It requires renegotiating territorial agreements with spirits who might have shifted their domains during winter months, when human activity focused on different areas of the house. Autumn preparation includes supernatural as well as practical winterization, ensuring that all household spirits receive adequate offerings to sustain them through months when outdoor food sources become scarce. As you complete your morning rounds of spirit appeasement, distributing offerings and acknowledging the invisible helpers who share your domestic space, you realize that your Victorian home functions as a complex supernatural ecosystem where human and spirit residents collaborate to create safety, prosperity, and happiness that neither could achieve independently. You settle into your favourite armchair beside a crackling fireplace as December wind rattles the windows of your Victorian parlour, knowing that this season of supposed joy and celebration has transformed into the year's most spiritually active period. When the veil between worlds grows thin as Christmas pudding cloth and ghost stories become not mere entertainment but necessary preparation for supernatural encounters that peak during the darkest nights of winter. The tradition of Christmas ghost stories represents far more than seasonal amusement for Victorian families who understand that Yuletide supernatural activity increases dramatically as spirits of deceased relatives, ancient house ghosts, and wandering souls all converge during the holiday season when emotional intensity and family gatherings create ideal conditions for otherworldly manifestations. Your family gathers around the fireplace as your grandfather begins this year's selections of Christmas ghost tales, each story carefully chosen not just for its ability to entertain, but for its educational value in teaching listeners how to recognize, interpret, and survive supernatural encounters that become increasingly likely as a Christmas approaches. Tonight's first story features a Victorian gentleman who ignored warning signs of ghostly presence in his country estate, ultimately paying for his skepticism when the family spirit demanded recognition through increasingly dramatic manifestations that culminated in Christmas Eve revelations about hidden family secrets buried with previous generations. The practice of Christmas ghost storytelling emerged from practical necessity rather than mere Gothic fashion, as Victorian society recognised that winter's long dark nights, combined with holiday emotional intensity, created perfect conditions for supernatural activity that required careful preparation and community wisdom sharing. Families would gather throughout December to exchange accounts of recent ghostly encounters, comparing notes about effective protection methods and warning signs that helped identify when supernatural intervention might be approaching their own households. Ghost stories serve as coded instruction manuals for supernatural survival, teaching listeners through narrative example how to distinguish between helpful family spirits and dangerous wandering ghosts, how to respond appropriately to different types of supernatural communication, and how to protect households from malevolent entities that might attempt to infiltrate Christmas celebrations. The stories follow established patterns that reinforce crucial lessons. Skepticism leads to supernatural punishment. Respect for the dead brings protection and guidance, and proper ritual observance prevents most ghostly problems before they can escalate into serious spiritual crises. Your Aunt contributes tonight's second tale about a Victorian Christmas Eve séance that successfully contacted 3 generations of deceased family members who delivered crucial warnings about business investments, romantic relationships, and health concerns that proved remarkably accurate when the living relatives followed the spirit's guidance. This story type, featuring beneficial supernatural intervention, teaches listeners to recognize opportunities for positive ghostly communication while emphasizing the importance of treating such encounters with appropriate reverence and gratitude. The seasonal timing of ghost story traditions aligns with astronomical and religious factors that supposedly increase supernatural activity during winter months when darkness dominates daily experience, and Christian celebration of divine incarnation creates spiritual openings between heavenly and earthly realms. The winter solstice, marking the year's longest night, represents peak supernatural accessibility when spirits find it easiest to manifest in the physical world. Christmas itself, celebrating the miraculous birth of Christ, creates additional spiritual energy that ghosts can harness for communication with living relatives. Historians still argue whether Christmas ghost story traditions originated from ancient pagan winter celebrations or developed as Christian adaptations of older supernatural practices that survive religious transformation. What's certain is their universal adoption across Victorian social classes, with wealthy families employing professional storytellers for elaborate Christmas ghost story marathons, while working-class households gathered around kitchen fires to share inherited tales passed down through generations of supernatural survivors. Children's participation in Christmas ghost story sessions requires careful supervision to ensure that young minds receive appropriate supernatural education without suffering psychological damage from exposure to frightening otherworldly concepts. Stories told to children emphasize protective spirits, guardian angels, deceased grandparents, helpful house ghosts, rather than malevolent entities that might traumatize impressionable young listeners. Some families designate specific storytellers who specialize in age-appropriate supernatural narratives that teach, without terrifying. The ghost story themselves follow established categories that address different aspects of supernatural survival knowledge that Victorian families need to navigate winter's increased spiritual activity. Warning stories feature ghosts who appear to prevent disasters, teaching listeners to recognize and heed supernatural alerts about impending dangers. Revenge stories describe spirits seeking justice for past wrongs, emphasizing the importance of treating others fairly to avoid posthumous supernatural punishment. Redemption stories showcase souls earning peace through good deeds, encouraging moral behavior that benefits both living and dead community members. Regional variations in Christmas ghost story traditions reflect local supernatural folklore while addressing universal themes that transcend geographical boundaries. Yorkshire tales feature moorland spirits who wander during winter storms, teaching families to prepare for weather-related dangers and supernatural encounters that accompany severe atmospheric disturbances. London stories focus on urban ghosts, plague victims, industrial accident casualties, murder victims who haunt city streets during Christmas season when their unresolved earthly concerns resurface with particular intensity. Professional ghost story entertainment has evolved into sophisticated art form that combines literary skill with supernatural education. As accomplished storytellers develop reputations for delivering tales that both entertain audiences and provide genuine preparation for likely supernatural encounters. These professionals study local ghost folklore, interview families about their supernatural experiences, and craft narratives that address specific regional spiritual concerns while maintaining universal appeal that makes their stories valuable across different communities. Your grandfather concludes tonight's session with a story about Christmas morning supernatural encounters that emphasize the season's potential for positive spiritual experiences rather than frightening otherworldly threats. This tale features a Victorian family who discovered that their Christmas decorations had been mysteriously enhanced overnight by helpful spirits who wanted to contribute to the holiday celebration, teaching listeners that supernatural entities often share human joy and desire to participate in family happiness when treated with appropriate welcome and respect. The evening's ghost stories serve multiple functions beyond entertainment. They strengthen family bonds through shared supernatural education, provide practical guidance for managing likely winter spiritual encounters, and create cultural continuity by preserving ancestral wisdom about supernatural survival techniques that might otherwise be lost as modern skepticism challenges traditional belief systems. Each story becomes part of the family's supernatural defense arsenal, equipping listeners with knowledge they might need when facing their own otherworldly encounters during the spiritually active Christmas season. Religious authorities maintain complex relationships with Christmas ghost story traditions, officially discouraged by the church doctrine, that emphasizes Christian supernatural beliefs while privately acknowledged by clergy who recognize that ghost stories often reinforce moral teachings and community solidarity more effectively than formal sermons. Some progressive ministers actually incorporate ghost story elements into Christmas homilies, using supernatural narratives to illustrate religious themes about redemption, justice, and the persistence of love beyond death. The commercial aspects of Christmas ghost story culture have created entire industries dedicated to seasonal supernatural entertainment, with publishers producing special Christmas ghost story collections, theatres staging supernatural Christmas plays, and professional storytellers commanding premium fees for holiday supernatural entertainment services. This commercialization spreads supernatural knowledge more widely, while sometimes diluting the practical survival education that originally motivated the tradition. As the fire burns low and family members retire to their respective bedrooms, each carrying ghost story wisdom that might prove essential during the coming night's potential supernatural encounters, you realize that Christmas ghost stories represent Victorian society's sophisticated approach to seasonal spiritual preparation, transforming necessary supernatural education into beloved family tradition that protects while it entertains. You sit in Dr. Hartwell's consulting room as he writes prescriptions that blend modern medical science with supernatural remedies, carefully documenting both the scientific dosage of laudanum for your persistent cough and the mystical instructions for brewing protective herbal tea that must be prepared during specific lunar phases to achieve maximum healing effectiveness. Victorian physicians navigate a complex professional landscape where medical school training coexists with ancestral healing wisdom, creating treatment protocols that address both physical symptoms and the spiritual imbalances that supposedly cause illness when supernatural forces infiltrate the human body through weakened defenses. Dr. Hartwell opens his leather medical bag to reveal compartments containing not just scalpels, stethoscope, and mercury thermometer, but also small vials of blessed water, protective amulets crafted from medicinal metals, and carefully preserved herbs that have been gathered according to astrological timing that enhances their healing properties. This dual approach to medical practice reflects Victorian society's understanding that illness often results from supernatural attacks that require spiritual countermeasures alongside physical treatment to achieve complete recovery. The prescription he hands you contains detailed instructions that would puzzle modern patients, but seem perfectly reasonable to Victorian invalids who understand that healing involves more than simply ingesting chemical compounds. The laudanum must be taken while facing east during sunrise hours when divine healing energy flows strongest, while the herbal tea requires preparation using water that has been exposed to moonlight for exactly 3 nights to absorb lunar healing properties that amplify the herb's natural medicinal effects. Your treatment regimen includes wearing a small copper bracelet that supposedly draws illness from your body through the metal's natural electrical properties, while also serving as a spiritual conductor that channels healing energy from protective spirits who specialize in respiratory ailments. The bracelet must be worn continuously for 21 days, a mystically significant period that allows supernatural healing forces sufficient time to identify, isolate, and eliminate whatever spiritual contamination has compromised your physical health. Dr. Hartwell explains that your persistent cough likely resulted from exposure to malevolent spirits during your recent visit to the cemetery, where you inadvertently inhaled supernatural contamination that has now manifested as physical respiratory distress. This diagnosis requires treatment protocols that address both the cough's physical symptoms and its underlying spiritual causes, preventing the illness from recurring once the initial medical intervention concludes. The medicinal herbs prescribed for your condition must be gathered according to specific supernatural protocols that ensure maximum healing potency, while avoiding spiritual contamination that might worsen your condition rather than improving it. Coltsfoot for respiratory relief should be harvested during the waning moon when the plant's healing properties concentrate most effectively, while elderflower for fever reduction requires collection during dawn hours when dew has blessed the blossoms with divine healing energy. Historians still argue whether Victorian medical supernatural practices represented holdovers from medieval healing traditions or emerged as responses to modern medicine's limitations in treating diseases that conventional science couldn't adequately explain or cure. What's certain is that many Victorian physicians successfully combined scientific medical training with traditional healing wisdom, achieving treatment outcomes that satisfied both medical establishment requirements and patient expectations for comprehensive supernatural protection. The timing of medical treatments follows astrological calendars that Victorian doctors study as seriously as anatomy textbooks. Understanding that planetary alignments affect both human health and medicinal effectiveness in ways that pure chemistry cannot predict or control. Mercury retrograde periods require percepting surgical procedures that might be complicated by communication disruptions between surgeon and patient, while Mars conjunctions provide optimal timing for treatments requiring aggressive intervention against stubborn illnesses that resist gentler therapeutic approaches. Dr. Hartwell's medical practice incorporates protective rituals that safeguard both doctor and patient from supernatural contamination that might interfere with healing processes or transfer spiritual illness between individuals during medical examinations. His examining room contains iron fixtures that supposedly prevent malevolent spirits from observing medical procedures, while blessed candles burning during consultations create sacred space that supernatural ailments cannot tolerate. The medicinal preparation process requires elaborate protocols that transform ordinary herbs into supernatural healing agents through careful attention to mystical timing, spiritual blessing, and protective purification. Herbs must be dried in consecrated spaces where no arguments or negative emotions have occurred, ensuring that the healing plants absorb only positive spiritual energy that enhances rather than contaminates their medicinal properties. Your prescription includes specific dietary restrictions that address both nutritional healing requirements and supernatural contamination prevention, as certain foods supposedly weaken spiritual defenses while others strengthen the body's natural resistance to supernatural illness. Red meat provides physical strength but might attract carnivorous spirits that feed on blood-based energy, while vegetables offer gentle healing that spirits of deceased herbalists often bless with additional curative power. The preparation of medicinal teas requires ritualistic attention to detail that ensures supernatural healing. Spirits recognize and assist the brewing process, rather than interfering with it through mischievous contamination. The water must be drawn from natural sources, wells, springs, or rainwater collection, rather than municipal supplies that might contain spiritual impurities from urban, supernatural contamination. Brewing vessels should be made from materials that conduct positive spiritual energy, copper, silver, or ceramic blessed by religious authorities. Victorian medical supernatural practices extend beyond individual treatment to include household protection protocols that prevent illness from recurring or spreading to other family members through supernatural transmission that conventional quarantine methods cannot contain. Protective herbs burned as incense supposedly purify contaminated air, while iron objects placed around sick rooms create barriers that supernatural ailments cannot cross to infect healthy family members. The doctor's medical education included formal training in supernatural diagnosis techniques that help practitioners distinguish between purely physical ailments and conditions that require spiritual intervention alongside conventional medical treatment. Symptoms that appear during specific times of day, respond unusually to standard medications, or coincide with supernatural events in the patient's household suggest spiritual components that pure medical science cannot adequately address. Payment for medical, supernatural services follows protocols that honor both professional medical standards and traditional healing customs, as practitioners who combine scientific and spiritual approaches must satisfy requirements from both medical establishments and supernatural healing traditions. Some doctors accept payment in protective talismans, blessed herbs, or spiritual services rather than purely monetary compensation. Recognizing that healing relationships involve more than simple commercial transactions, the medical equipment used in supernatural healing practices include specialized instruments that serve both scientific diagnostic purposes and spiritual protective functions. Creating medical tools that address Victorian physicians' needs for comprehensive patient care. Stethoscopes made from metals known for supernatural protective properties supposedly allow doctors to hear not just heartbeats and breathing patterns, but also spiritual disturbances that might indicate supernatural illness requiring specialized treatment. Dr. Hartwell's medical records document both physical symptoms and spiritual circumstances surrounding each patient's illness, creating comprehensive case histories that help identify patterns linking supernatural events to physical health problems. These detailed records allow Victorian physicians to recognize early warning signs of spiritually transmitted illness, while also building databases of supernatural healing knowledge that can benefit future patients facing similar supernatural health challenges. Patient education includes instruction in supernatural health maintenance protocols that prevent illness recurrence, while also building spiritual resistance that protects against future supernatural health threats. Patients learn to recognize early signs of spiritual contamination, implement protective daily rituals that maintain spiritual health, and seek appropriate supernatural medical intervention before minor spiritual imbalances develop into serious physical ailments, requiring more dramatic medical supernatural intervention. As you leave Dr. Hartwell's office, with your complex prescription combining laudanum, lunar-blessed herbs, copper bracelet, and detailed spiritual protection protocols. You understand that Victorian medicine offers comprehensive healing that addresses both your cough's immediate physical symptoms and the underlying supernatural vulnerabilities that allowed illness to penetrate your normally healthy constitution. You arrive at the Theatre Royal on this foggy Victorian evening, stepping through ornate doors into a world where ancient superstitions govern every aspect of theatrical life from the moment actors first set foot on stage until the final curtain falls and beyond, creating an elaborate supernatural ecosystem that treats the theatre not merely as entertainment venue, but as sacred space where the boundary between reality and illusion grows so thin that spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, regularly cross over to participate in dramatic performances alongside living actors who know better than to ignore the ghostly traditions that protect their careers and their lives. The theatre's backstage area buzzes with pre-performance rituals that would seem bizarre to modern audiences, but represent essential supernatural protocols for Victorian performers who understand that theatrical success depends as much on appeasing theatrical spirits as on memorizing lines and executing proper stage movement. You watch actors carefully avoiding the ghost light, that single candle or gas flame that must burn continuously throughout the night when the theatre stands empty, providing illumination for resident spirits who supposedly rehearse their own supernatural performances during the dark hours when human actors have departed. The ghost light serves multiple crucial functions in theatrical supernatural tradition. It prevents malevolent spirits from taking complete possession of the darkened theatre, provides navigation assistance for friendly ghosts who want to observe human performances without interfering with living actors, and maintains the spiritual boundary between performance space and ordinary reality that allows theatrical magic to function properly without bleeding dangerously into audience members' daily lives after they leave the theatre. The ancient taboo against speaking the name Macbeth inside any theatre demonstrates the power of theatrical superstitions that have survived centuries of cultural change because they address genuine supernatural dangers that affect theatrical productions in measurable ways. You hear actors referring to Shakespeare's Scottish play only as the Scottish play or that play, to avoid invoking the curse that supposedly follows any production where the forbidden name is spoken carelessly within theatre walls, bringing injury, financial disaster, or even death to cast members who violate this fundamental rule of theatrical supernatural protocol. The Macbeth curse allegedly originated from Shakespeare's incorporation of actual witchcraft spells into the play's supernatural scenes, creating dramatic text that functions as genuine magical incantation rather than mere theatrical dialogue. When actors speak these cursed lines during performance, they supposedly activate real supernatural forces that continue affecting the theatre long after the final curtain, requiring elaborate purification rituals to neutralize the spiritual contamination before the space becomes safe for subsequent productions. Historians still argue whether theatrical superstitions developed from medieval religious drama traditions or emerged independently as responses to the psychological pressures and physical dangers inherent in live performance. But what remains undisputed is their universal adoption throughout Victorian theatre culture, where even the most scientifically minded performers carefully observe supernatural protocols that protect their professional careers and personal safety. The tradition of leaving fresh flowers on stage after each performance honours the theatre's resident spirits, who supposedly assist with successful productions when properly acknowledged, but who might sabotage future shows if neglected or insulted by thoughtless human performers. Different types of flowers carry specific meanings in theatrical supernatural communication, White roses express gratitude for spiritual protection during dangerous dramatic scenes. Red roses acknowledge ghostly assistance with passionate romantic performances, and yellow roses apologize for any inadvertent disrespect that might have offended supernatural theatre residents. Backstage mirrors require careful supernatural management to prevent them from becoming portals through which malevolent spirits might enter the theatre during vulnerable moments when actors are concentrating on character transformation rather than spiritual protection. Mirrors must be covered with cloth during rehearsals of supernatural plays, uncovered only during actual performances, when the combined spiritual energy of audience and cast supposedly provides sufficient protection against unwanted otherworldly visitors who might attempt to join the performance uninvited. The green room, where actors gather before and after performances, maintains its own collection of supernatural traditions designed to promote company harmony, while protecting individual performers from spiritual attacks that jealous rivals might direct towards successful colleagues. Peacock feathers, despite their beauty, are strictly forbidden in green rooms because their eye-like patterns supposedly attract the evil eye that could curse entire productions with failure, injury, or financial disaster that devastates theatre companies. Opening night traditions incorporate elaborate supernatural protocols that supposedly determine whether new productions will achieve commercial and artistic success or suffer the mysterious failures that plague theatrical ventures lacking proper spiritual preparation. The first performance must begin with specific protective rituals, salt scattered around the stage perimeter, blessed candles lit in designated patterns, and prayers offered to theatrical patron saints who specialize in protecting actors from the unique spiritual dangers associated with live dramatic performance. Costume superstitions govern the supernatural aspects of theatrical transformation that allow actors to safely inhabit fictional characters without losing their own spiritual identity to the roles they portray night after night throughout long theatrical runs. Real jewellery must never be worn during supernatural plays, as genuine precious metals and stones might attract spiritual entities who covet beautiful objects and could possess actors wearing authentic treasures. Stage jewellery, crafted from base metals and glass, provides visual authenticity while avoiding the spiritual complications that arise when actors wear items with genuine supernatural value. The colour yellow carries particular supernatural danger in theatrical contexts, representing betrayal, cowardice, and spiritual contamination that could spread through entire companies if introduced carelessly into costume designs or stage decorations. Actors who accidentally wear yellow items during performance risk career disasters that extend far beyond individual productions, potentially ending their theatrical careers through supernatural punishment that manifests as recurring professional failures, mysterious injuries, or inexplicable loss of dramatic ability. Theatrical ghosts represent a specialized category of resident spirits who supposedly inhabit theaters throughout their operational lifetimes, forming supernatural communities that parallel the human theatrical companies who use the same spaces for dramatic performance. These theatrical spirits often consist of deceased actors, playwrights, musicians, and theatre workers who loved their professional environments so intensely that death couldn't separate them from their theatrical homes, creating ghostly residents who continue participating in dramatic activities long after their physical deaths. The most famous theatrical ghosts develop individual reputations and personalities that living theatre company learn to accommodate through regular supernatural diplomacy designed to maintain peaceful coexistence between human and ghostly performers. Some theatrical spirits assist with productions by providing inspiration during difficult rehearsals, protecting actors from stage accidents, or ensuring that technical equipment functions properly during crucial performances. Others demand recognition through specific tribute performances, preferred seating arrangements, or regular offerings that acknowledge their continued residence and interest in theatrical affairs. Audience participation in theatrical, supernatural traditions creates complex interactions between performers and spectators who share temporary spiritual community during live dramatic performances that supposedly open supernatural channels between stage and auditorium. Applause serves supernatural as well as social functions, providing spiritual energy that resident theatre ghosts can harvest to sustain their otherworldly existence, while also creating protective barriers that prevent malevolent spirits from using audience emotions to infiltrate theatrical space during vulnerable performance moments. Closing night rituals conclude theatrical runs with ceremonies designed to properly dismiss any supernatural forces that accumulated during the production's performance history, while ensuring that resident theatre spirits remain satisfied with their treatment and willing to assist future productions. These concluding ceremonies often involve symbolic offerings, gratitude expressions, and formal farewells that maintain positive relationships between human theatre companies and ghostly residents who will continue inhabiting the space long after current productions end. As tonight's performance concludes and you exit the theatre into the foggy Victorian streets, you carry with you the lingering sensation of having participated in ancient supernatural traditions that transform ordinary entertainment into sacred ritual, where human and spiritual performers collaborate to create dramatic magic that transcends mere theatrical illusion. You stand at the railway station platform clutching your carpet bag while mentally reviewing the elaborate checklist of travel omens that could determine whether your journey to Edinburgh will conclude with profitable business success or devastating personal calamity. Knowing that Victorian travel represents far more than simple transportation between geographical locations, it's a supernatural gauntlet where every detail from departure timing to luggage placement could either invoke protective spirits or trigger malevolent forces that delight in transforming innocent journeys into nightmarish ordeals that leave travellers financially ruined, physically injured, or spiritually contaminated by exposure to hostile supernatural territories. The station clock strikes 9 as you prepare to board the morning train, and you breathe a sigh of relief knowing that departure during odd-numbered hours brings good fortune to travellers, while even-numbered departures warn of complications, delays, and unpleasant surprises that could transform your carefully planned business trip into an expensive disaster. Victorian travellers maintain detailed almanacs documenting the supernatural implications of departure timing, understanding that the moment you begin your journey establishes the spiritual foundation for everything that follows during your time away from home's protective environment. Your careful selection of travelling companions reflects more than social preferences or business networking opportunities. It represents crucial supernatural strategy designed to create protective group energy that shields individual travellers from spiritual attacks that might overwhelm solitary journeys through potentially hostile supernatural territories. The elderly gentleman sharing your railway compartment carries a silver-headed walking stick that supposedly repels highway spirits, while the middle-aged lady across from you wears a mourning locket containing protective hair from her deceased husband, who continues guarding her travels from beyond the grave. The supernatural significance of travel direction affects your journey's spiritual implications in ways that practical route planning cannot address through conventional geographical considerations. Travelling north supposedly brings new opportunities and fresh beginnings, but also exposes travellers to harsh spiritual climates that test resolve and courage through challenging supernatural encounters. Eastward travel promises wisdom and enlightenment but requires spiritual preparation for encountering ancient knowledge that might overwhelm unprepared minds with truths too profound for ordinary human comprehension. Westward journeys offer adventure and discovery, but warn travellers about potential losses, financial, emotional or spiritual, that could occur when venturing into unknown territories where familiar protective spirits cannot extend their influence. Southward travel suggests comfort and security, but might lead to spiritual stagnation that prevents personal growth through the challenging experiences that promote character development and supernatural wisdom. The railway carriage itself becomes a temporary supernatural sanctuary that requires careful spiritual preparation to ensure safe passage through potentially dangerous otherworldly territories that trains traverse during long-distance journeys. Iron wheels on iron rails create protective circles that evil spirits supposedly cannot penetrate, while the constant forward motion confuses malevolent entities that might attempt to board moving trains and influence passengers through supernatural interference disguised as travel delays, mechanical failures, or interpersonal conflicts between strangers forced to share confined spaces. Your luggage arrangement follows protocols designed to prevent spiritual contamination from spreading between personal belongings that might carry supernatural influences from previous locations where they were stored or used. Clothing must be packed in specific orders that prevent negative energy from contaminating protective garments, while toiletries and medications require separation from items that might have absorbed spiritual residue from your home environment that could conflict with supernatural influences encountered during travel. Historians still argue whether travel superstitions developed from ancient pilgrimage traditions or emerged as responses to the genuine dangers associated with Victorian transportation systems that frequently subjected travellers to accidents, robberies, and exposure to diseases that spread rapidly through crowded railway carriages and coaching inns. What remains certain is that experienced Victorian travellers developed sophisticated supernatural protection systems that addressed both practical safety concerns and spiritual vulnerabilities that increased when venturing beyond familiar protective territories. The landscape visible through your carriage window carries supernatural significance that experienced travellers learn to interpret like navigational charts, showing spiritual rather than geographical terrain features. Crossing water, streams, rivers, lakes supposedly provides purification opportunities that cleanse travellers of negative spiritual influences accumulated during previous journey segments, but also creates vulnerability periods when protective barriers weaken and malevolent spirits might attempt to infiltrate travelling parties during bridge crossings or ferry rides. Mountain passages present particular supernatural challenges that require additional protective measures beyond normal travel precautions, as elevated terrain supposedly brings travellers closer to spiritual realms, where normal protective protocols might prove inadequate against supernatural forces that operate more freely in atmospheric conditions that blur boundaries between earthly and otherworldly territories. Some Victorian travellers carry special altitude blessing amulets designed specifically for mountain travel, where thin air might compromise spiritual as well as physical breathing. Forest passages through wooded areas demand constant vigilance against tree spirits, woodland fairies, and other sylvan supernatural entities that might resent human intrusion into their ancient territories and respond with mischievous or malevolent interference that manifests as sudden mechanical failures, inexplicable route confusion, or mysterious illnesses that appear without obvious physical causes. Experienced forest travellers maintain offering pouches containing nuts, berries, and small coins that can be scattered as peace gifts when passing through particularly dense woodland areas. The accommodation selection process during extended journeys requires evaluation of each inn's supernatural reputation alongside practical considerations like food quality, room cleanliness, and reasonable pricing, as some lodging establishments supposedly harbour restless spirits from previous guests who died on the premises and might continue influencing current visitors through nightmares, unexplained illnesses, or financial disasters that manifest after returning home from contaminated accommodations. Innkeepers who understand supernatural hospitality maintain protective protocols that safeguard guest rooms from spiritual contamination while providing services that address travellers' supernatural as well as physical needs. Iron bed frames supposedly prevent spiritual intrusion during vulnerable sleeping hours, while blessed water provided for washing removes travel-accumulated spiritual contamination that might otherwise transfer to personal belongings or continue affecting travellers after they return to their home environments. Meal selection during travel follows supernatural dietary guidelines that address spiritual, as well as nutritional requirements for maintaining protective energy levels, while avoiding foods that might weaken supernatural defenses or attract unwanted spiritual attention from entities that feed on specific types of human energy. Local specialties often carry regional, spiritual influences that might conflict with travellers' home-based protective system, requiring careful evaluation before consumption. The return journey presents unique supernatural challenges that differ significantly from outbound travel considerations, as travellers now carry spiritual influences absorbed from visited locations that might conflict with their home environment's established supernatural ecosystem. Purification rituals become necessary to prevent spiritual contamination from disrupting domestic harmony or introducing foreign supernatural influences that could destabilize household protective systems. Luggage inspection upon return involves more than checking for physical damage or missing items. Experienced travellers examine their belongings for signs of spiritual contamination that might have occurred during exposure to unfamiliar supernatural territories. Clothing might retain spiritual residue from hotels. Personal items could harbour hitchhiking spirits that followed travellers home, and souvenirs often carry supernatural influences from their places of origin that require careful spiritual quarantine before integration into home environments. Travel documentation includes more than tickets, itineraries, and business correspondence. Wise Victorian travellers maintain spiritual journey logs that record supernatural encounters, protection methods that proved effective, and warning signs that might help them navigate future journeys more safely. These personal supernatural travel guides become valuable family resources that subsequent generations can consult when planning their own journeys through potentially dangerous spiritual territories. As your train approaches Edinburgh Station and you prepare to disembark into unfamiliar supernatural territory, you review the protective protocols that will guide your business activities in this new environment. Knowing that successful travel requires constant attention to supernatural as well as practical considerations that determine whether journeys conclude with achievement of original goals or unexpected complications that transform simple business trips into expensive supernatural education experiences. You enter the hushed Victorian sick room where your grandmother lies dying, stepping into a sacred space where the boundary between life and death grows gossamer thin, and every breath, every whispered word, every flicker of candlelight carries profound supernatural significance that will determine not only how peacefully her soul departs this earthly realm, but also whether her spirit finds immediate heavenly rest or becomes trapped in restless wandering that could haunt your family for generations to come. The room itself has been transformed into a supernatural sanctuary through elaborate rituals designed to ease the dying process, while protecting both the departing soul and surviving family members from the dangerous spiritual forces that supposedly gather around deathbeds like spiritual vultures waiting to claim souls that aren't properly prepared for their final journey. The dying chamber's windows stand slightly open despite the cold December air, ensuring that your grandmother's soul will have an unobstructed pathway to heaven when the moment of departure arrives, preventing her spirit from becoming trapped inside the room where it might linger as a confused ghost unable to complete its transition to the afterlife. Victorian deathbed protocols require meticulous attention to these physical details that facilitate smooth supernatural transition, understanding that obstacles to proper soul departure create conditions for haunting that could disturb family peace for decades after the physical death occurs. Heavy curtains frame the sickbed, but remain pulled back during daylight hours to prevent shadows from gathering around the dying person, as darkness supposedly attracts malevolent spirits who seek to claim souls during their vulnerable departure moments when normal spiritual defenses weaken and protective barriers temporarily fail. The room's lighting requires careful management throughout the death vigil, sufficient illumination to guide departing souls toward heavenly light, but not so bright as to confuse spirits who might mistake artificial lighting for divine radiance and attempt to follow false spiritual signals. Your grandmother's positioning in the bed follows ancient traditions that align her body with cosmic forces governing a peaceful death and successful soul transition to whatever spiritual realm awaits beyond physical existence. Her head faces east toward the sunrise, symbolically preparing her spirit for the dawn of eternal life, while ensuring that her final breath travels in the same direction that souls supposedly journey when departing earthly existence for heavenly destinations. Her hands rest folded over a small wooden cross that will accompany her spirit during its journey, providing divine protection against any malevolent entities that might attempt to waylay souls during their vulnerable transition period. The deathbed vigil requires continuous family presence to ensure that your grandmother doesn't die alone, which Victorian supernatural wisdom considers one of the most tragic spiritual disasters that can befall a departing soul. Solitary death supposedly leaves spirits confused and frightened, unable to find their way to appropriate afterlife destinations without living relatives to provide guidance, comfort, and protective energy during the crucial moments when souls separate from physical bodies and begin their supernatural journey toward whatever eternal destiny awaits them. Family members take shifts maintaining constant bedside presence while carefully monitoring your grandmother's breathing patterns for supernatural signs that indicate when final departure approaches, understanding that the dying process involves more than simple physical failure. It represents a complex spiritual transition that requires family assistance to complete successfully. Certain breathing patterns supposedly indicate that angels have arrived to escort the departing soul, while other respiratory rhythms warn that demonic forces might be attempting to claim the dying person's spirit for infernal rather than heavenly destinations. The room's spiritual atmosphere requires careful maintenance through prayers, hymns, and sacred readings that create protective barriers against malevolent influences while summoning divine assistance for the departing soul's journey into whatever supernatural realm awaits beyond physical death. Different religious traditions prescribe specific deathbed rituals designed to ensure proper spiritual transition. Catholic families arrange for last rites administration. Protestant households gather for final prayer sessions, while secular families might rely on traditional folk practices that predate organised religious customs. Historians still argue whether Victorian deathbed rituals represented genuine spiritual assistance for departing souls or primarily served psychological functions for grieving family members who needed structured activities to manage their emotional distress during painful loss experiences. What remains undisputed is the universal adoption of these practices across social classes and religious backgrounds, suggesting that deathbed supernatural protocols addressed fundamental human needs that transcended specific theological beliefs or cultural traditions. The moment of actual death requires immediate ritualistic response to ensure that your grandmother's soul departs safely, while preventing spiritual contamination from affecting surviving family members who remain vulnerable to supernatural influence during emotionally intense grief experiences. All clocks in the house must be stopped at the exact moment of death, symbolically freezing time to prevent the departing soul from becoming lost in temporal confusion that might interfere with proper spiritual navigation toward appropriate afterlife destinations. Mirrors throughout the house require immediate covering with black cloth to prevent your grandmother's spirit from becoming trapped in reflective surfaces, where it might remain as a confused ghost unable to complete its journey to whatever eternal realm awaits departed souls. These mirror covering protocols must be implemented within minutes of death to prevent spiritual entrapment that could result in household haunting that disturbs family peace for years after the physical death occurs. Windows and doors receive brief opening immediately after death to facilitate soul departure, creating clear pathways that departing spirits can follow without confusion or obstruction that might delay their transition to appropriate supernatural destinations. This opening ritual lasts only moments, long enough for soul departure but brief enough to prevent other spiritual entities from entering the house during vulnerable moments when normal protective barriers weaken due to death's spiritual disruption of household supernatural equilibrium. The preparation of your grandmother's physical remains follows protocols designed to honor her earthly existence while ensuring that her spirit doesn't become confused about its departure status or attempt to return to possess its former physical vessel during funeral preparations. Her eyes must be gently closed to prevent her spirit from witnessing its own physical deterioration, which supposedly causes distress that interferes with peaceful spiritual transition to whatever afterlife awaits departed souls. Coins placed over the closed eyes serve both practical and supernatural functions. They keep the eyelids properly closed during rigor mortis, while providing payment for spiritual ferryman services that supposedly transport souls across supernatural boundaries separating earthly existence from eternal destination. The coins must be genuine silver or gold to ensure acceptance by otherworldly transportation services that supposedly require precious metal payment for safe passage between spiritual realms. The deathbed vigil continues even after physical death occurs, as family members maintain protective presence around your grandmother's remains, while her spirit completes its gradual separation from earthly attachments that might otherwise bind her as an earthbound ghost unable to achieve proper spiritual rest. This post-death vigil typically lasts 3 days, allowing sufficient time for complete soul departure while providing family protection against any malevolent spirits that might attempt to claim recently vacated spiritual territory. Funeral preparation incorporates additional supernatural protocols designed to ensure that your grandmother's spirit achieves permanent peaceful rest, rather than returning as a restless ghost that disturbs family tranquility through supernatural manifestations that express unresolved earthly concerns or spiritual confusion about proper afterlife navigation. Every detail of funeral arrangement, from coffin construction to burial orientation, affects the deceased's spiritual comfort and the family's future supernatural safety. As the death vigil continues through the long night hours, with family members maintaining their protective presence around your grandmother's peaceful form, You understand that these ancient rituals represent humanity's oldest and most profound attempt to provide spiritual assistance during life's ultimate transition, ensuring that death becomes not a terrifying spiritual abandonment, but a carefully guided journey toward whatever eternal peace awaits souls that depart this earthly realm properly prepared and lovingly supported by those they leave behind. You wake in your modern bedroom, reaching instinctively for your smartphone to check the time, unaware that this simple morning gesture connects you to supernatural traditions, stretching back through centuries of human anxiety about unseen forces that continue influencing daily life in ways so subtle and pervasive that most contemporary people never recognize how deeply Victorian superstitions have woven themselves into the fabric of 21st century existence. The salt you automatically sprinkle on spilled coffee, the unconscious knock on wood when mentioning good fortune, the slight unease you feel when walking under ladders. These seemingly casual behaviours represent the living legacy of Victorian supernatural wisdom that persists because, deep in our collective unconscious, we sense that some protective traditions transcend scientific rationality and address human vulnerabilities that no amount of technological progress can completely eliminate. Your morning routine incorporates dozens of supernatural behaviours inherited from Victorian ancestors who understood that invisible forces require constant acknowledgement and appeasement to maintain the delicate balance between human ambition and cosmic forces that remain largely beyond scientific understanding or technological control. The mirror you consult while preparing for work carries the same potential for spiritual contamination that terrified Victorian households. Though contemporary society has largely forgotten why breaking mirrors brings 7 years of bad luck, or why some people still feel uncomfortable looking into mirrors in darkened rooms. The black cat crossing your path during your commute to work triggers an automatic response that bypasses rational thought. A moment of anxiety followed by unconscious protective gestures that connect you to Victorian supernatural protocols designed to neutralize feline-transmitted bad luck through specific countermeasures. Even people who consciously reject superstitious thinking often find themselves responding to these ancient triggers with behaviours they cannot logically explain, suggesting that Victorian supernatural wisdom tapped into psychological mechanisms that remain active despite centuries of scientific advancement. Modern wedding traditions preserve Victorian supernatural protocols in forms so thoroughly integrated into contemporary celebration customs that most couples never recognize the spiritual significance underlying their carefully planned ceremonies. The white wedding dress, the veil, the careful arrangement of flowers, the insistence on specific timing for various ceremonial elements. These contemporary wedding requirements represent direct inheritance from Victorian supernatural marriage protection rituals designed to shield new unions from spiritual threats that could destroy marital happiness before it properly establishes itself. Your office building incorporates architectural features that Victorian supernatural wisdom would immediately recognize as protective elements designed to create spiritually safe working environments where human productivity can flourish without interference from malevolent forces that supposedly threaten business success. Iron structural elements, specific arrangements of reflective surfaces, careful attention to lighting patterns that discourage supernatural habitation. These design choices reflect unconscious continuation of Victorian building protection traditions that persist because they address psychological needs for security and control that remain constant across historical periods. Contemporary medical practices retain elements of Victorian supernatural healing traditions through complementary and alternative medicine approaches that blend scientific treatment with spiritual healing methods that address patients' psychological and emotional needs alongside their physical symptoms. Acupuncture, herbal medicine, meditation-based therapies, and holistic health approaches represent modern evolution of Victorian understanding that healing involves more than purely mechanical medical intervention. It requires attention to spiritual and emotional factors that affect physical health in ways that conventional medicine sometimes struggles to address adequately. The entertainment industry has transformed Victorian supernatural beliefs into commercial products that satisfy contemporary audiences' continued fascination with otherworldly phenomena, while providing safe, controlled exposure to spiritual concepts that our rational society officially rejects but emotionally craves. Ghost hunting television programs, paranormal investigation entertainment, supernatural horror films, and psychic consultation services represent modern manifestations of Victorian spiritual curiosity that persist because human beings continue experiencing phenomena that scientific materialism cannot adequately explain or dismiss. Historians still argue whether contemporary supernatural beliefs represent genuine continuation of Victorian spiritual wisdom, or merely nostalgic entertainment that provides psychological comfort without addressing real spiritual needs or supernatural realities. What remains undisputed is the commercial success of supernatural entertainment, the persistence of protective behaviors that most people cannot rationally justify, and the widespread popularity of spiritual practices that blend ancient wisdom with contemporary psychological understanding. Modern technology has created new categories of supernatural anxiety that Victorian society could never have anticipated, but that follow. Patterns remarkably similar to 19th century spiritual concerns about invisible forces affecting human welfare through means that ordinary perception cannot detect or control. Electromagnetic radiation fears, concerns about digital surveillance affecting spiritual privacy, worries about artificial intelligence developing consciousness that might conflict with human interests. These contemporary anxieties parallel Victorian supernatural concerns about invisible entities influencing human life through supernatural means. The contemporary self-help industry incorporates Victorian supernatural concepts through psychological frameworks that make spiritual practices acceptable to scientifically minded modern consumers who want protective benefits without acknowledging belief in supernatural phenomena. Positive thinking, visualization techniques, manifestation practices, and energy healing approaches represent secular translations of Victorian spiritual protection methods that persist because they provide psychological benefits regardless of their supernatural validity. Social media platforms have created digital environments where Victorian supernatural traditions find new expression through online communities dedicated to sharing protective rituals, supernatural experiences, and spiritual wisdom that helps participants navigate contemporary life challenges using ancient methods adapted for modern circumstances. These virtual spiritual communities demonstrate humanity's continued need for supernatural guidance and protective traditions that provide comfort and control in an uncertain world. Modern parenting incorporates numerous Victorian child protection superstitions through safety practices that blend rational precaution with unconscious spiritual protection impulses inherited from ancestors who understood that children require both physical and supernatural safeguarding, baby blessing ceremonies, protective jewelry for infants, careful attention to nursery arrangements that discourage negative influences. These contemporary parenting practices echo Victorian understanding that children need comprehensive protection against threats that transcend purely physical dangers. Urban planning and architecture continue incorporating elements that Victorian supernatural wisdom would recognize as spiritual protection features, designed to create communities where human life can flourish without interference from malevolent influences that supposedly gather in environments lacking proper protective design. Parks and green spaces that interrupt urban development patterns, water features that provide purification symbolism, public art that incorporates protective imagery. These design elements reflect unconscious continuation of Victorian community protection traditions. The persistence of Victorian supernatural beliefs in contemporary culture suggests that human beings possess psychological needs that transcend historical periods and technological advancement, needs for control over unpredictable forces, protection against invisible threats, and connection to spiritual wisdom that provides meaning beyond material existence. Whether these needs reflect genuine supernatural realities or represent evolutionary psychological mechanisms designed to help humans navigate uncertain environments remains a matter of individual belief and cultural interpretation. As you prepare for sleep in your modern bedroom, perhaps unconsciously checking that your bedroom door is properly secured and that no mirrors reflect your sleeping form, you participate in protective traditions that connect you to countless generations of human beings who understood that peaceful rest requires more than physical comfort. It demands spiritual safety that some protective rituals provide, regardless of their scientific validity. The Victorian legacy lives on in these quiet moments when rationality yields to instinct, when protective behaviours assert themselves despite logical objection, and when ancient wisdom whispers that some human needs transcend scientific explanation and require acknowledgement of forces that remain mysterious despite centuries of technological progress that has transformed every other aspect of human existence. And so the Victorian world slowly fades into the gentle darkness of history, leaving behind only whispers of salt circles and mirror coverings, the faint scent of protective herbs, drifting through time like memory itself. You feel yourself settling deeper into peaceful rest as these ancient voices grow softer, their urgent warnings about supernatural dangers transforming into lullabies that speak of protection and care that transcend the boundaries between past and present. The ghosts that once terrified Victorian households now seem less frightening, more like concerned relatives checking on your well-being as you drift towards sleep. The protective rituals that governed every moment of 19th century life become gentle rhythms that calm rather than concern, reminding you that human beings have always sought safety in uncertain worlds through traditions that connect us to something larger than our individual fears. Perhaps somewhere in the darkness, a kindly Victorian spirit straightens your blankets and whispers ancient blessings over your peaceful form, ensuring that protective traditions continue their quiet work even as conscious memory fades into dreams. The iron that once guarded against evil now guards your rest. The salt that once protected households now preserves your peaceful slumber, and the mirrors that once reflected dangerous spirits now reflect only serene contentment. Sleep comes softly now, carrying you beyond the reach of supernatural anxiety into realms where Victorian wisdom transforms into gentle comfort, where protective love transcends historical boundaries, and where the deepest human needs for safety and connection find their eternal rest in dreams that bridge every gap between then and now, between fear and peace, between waking worry and sleeping trust. The supernatural world grows quiet, settled, protective rather than threatening, watching over your rest with the same careful attention that generations of Victorian families brought to their nightly rituals of spiritual safety and loving care.